The Ford F-150 rolled through the main gate of Fort Liberty just after dawn, its paint faded to the color of old pennies, its engine ticking with the patient rhythm of 200,000 miles. The guard at the checkpoint was young, maybe 22, his uniform still crisp with that newness that comes before the first deployment, before the first time you wake up at 3 in the morning, convinced you can still smell the smoke. He checked the OD contractor badge twice, his eyes flicking between the laminated card and the woman behind the wheel. She didn't match. The photo showed someone younger, hair still streaked with dark brown, face fuller, eyes less distant. But the birth date was there, plain as day, 1957, which made her 68 years old, and the young guard had been raised right, had been taught to respect his elders, so he waved her through with a crisp nod that she didn't acknowledge. Eleanor Blackwood drove slowly through the morning mist that clung to the North Carolina pines, her hands steady on the wheel, her eyes tracking the familiar geometry of buildings she'd known when they had different names, when the whole installation had been called something else entirely. The Army had a habit of renaming things, as if new words could erase old ghosts. On the passenger seat beside her sat a wooden box, no bigger than a cigar humidor, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. She didn't look at it. She didn't need to. She knew every scratch on its surface the way she knew the lines on her own hands, the way she knew the precise trigger pull weight of every rifle she'd ever fired. 2.7 pounds, that was the number. Always 2.7 pounds between thought and consequence. The parking lot at Range 12 was empty, except for a cluster of Humvees and a single Toyota Tacoma that had seen better years. Eleanor pulled in beside them, killed the engine, and sat in the sudden silence. Through the windshield, she could see the range complex, the low concrete buildings that housed the armory, the covered firing positions stretching out like mechanical fingers pointing toward the distant target berms. A figure moved between the buildings, tall and lean, wearing the digital camouflage that still looked wrong to her eyes, too pixelated, too artificial. She watched him for a long moment, this man who carried half her genes and none of her memories, this grandson who thought he knew what war was because he'd read about it in briefings and heard about it in training sessions, and maybe had felt the edge of it during a deployment that lasted months instead of years. She picked up the wooden box. It weighed almost nothing. Inside was a badge shaped like a wolf's fang, silver gone dark with age, and 3 letters she'd written on nights when the pain medication made her hands steady enough to hold a pen, when her mind was clear enough to remember names that were already beginning to slip away like water through cupped hands. The door of the F-150 creaked when she opened it, a sound like an old man clearing his throat. Her boots hit the gravel with a soft crunch, and she stood there for a moment, breathing in the smell of pine and gun oil and red clay dust, smells that went so deep into her memory they existed below language, in that animal place where the body remembers what the mind cannot. She was wearing a red flannel shirt over a white tee, Levi's worn soft at the knees, boots that had walked through 3 continents and 2 wars. She looked like somebody's grandmother, which was exactly what she was. Except most grandmothers didn't carry a wooden box containing a badge that only 300 people in the history of the United States military had ever earned. Most grandmothers hadn't killed 173 people. She walked toward the range, her gait steady despite the arthritis that made her left knee click with every 3rd step, a souvenir from a parachute jump gone wrong in 1996, when she'd been young enough to think broken bones were badges of honor instead of promissory notes that the body would collect on later with interest. The tall figure emerged from between buildings, and Eleanor felt something catch in her chest, not quite pain, but close to it, that strange doubled vision of seeing him as he was now, this man in his 30s with his father's jawline and his grandfather's eyes, and seeing him as he'd been at 5 years old, gap-toothed and laughing, before his father had shipped out to Iraq, before the chaplain had arrived at the door with words that changed the shape of the world. He didn't see her at first. He was focused on a clipboard, checking off items with the methodical precision of a man who believed that if he followed the rules exactly, if he did everything by the book, nothing bad could happen. Eleanor recognized that faith. She'd carried it once, a long time ago, before Bosnia, before she'd learned that sometimes the book was written by people who'd never heard a bullet crack past their ear, never smelled what high explosives do to human tissue, never had to choose between following orders and following their conscience. She stopped 10 feet away from him, near a rack of M110 rifles, their barrels gleaming in the early morning light. She set the wooden box down on an equipment table with a soft click that shouldn't have been audible over the distant sound of engines and voices, but somehow was. He looked up. For a moment, they were just two strangers on an army range, and then recognition moved across his face like a shadow, surprise chasing confusion, chasing something that might have been annoyance. "Grandma Ellie?" His voice carried the flat vowels of North Carolina, overlaid with the crisp diction the Army drilled into its NCOs. "What are you? I didn't know you were coming to post. I didn't call ahead." Eleanor's voice was lower than most women's, roughened by years of shouting orders over gunfire and helicopter rotors. Figured it was easier to ask forgiveness than permission. He glanced around, checking to see if anyone else had noticed this irregular civilian presence in his training area. 3 younger soldiers were setting up targets downrange, too far away to overhear, but close enough to see. Eleanor could read the calculation in his eyes, the social mathematics of maintaining authority in front of subordinates while dealing with a family member who'd appeared unannounced. "The visitor area is back by the admin building," he said, his tone trying for gentle but landing closer to patronizing. "I can have somebody drive you over there. We're running a qualification course today, so the range is going to be restricted to authorized personnel." Eleanor didn't move. She looked at her grandson, really looked at him, trying to memorize the exact shade of his eyes, the small scar on his chin from a bicycle accident when he was 7, the way he held his shoulders, all detail. She was terrified of losing, details that were already starting to blur at the edges like photographs left too long in the sun. "I am authorized personnel," she said quietly. "My credentials were checked at the gate and logged at range control. I'm here on official business." David Reeves, Sergeant First Class, United States Army, looked at his grandmother with the patient exasperation of someone explaining simple concepts to a confused elder. "Grandma, you're a retiree. You might have a DOD contractor badge for the commissary or the clinic, but that doesn't give you access to active training ranges. This is a safety issue." He reached for the clipboard, clearly intending to show her the roster, to prove with official documentation that her name wasn't on any list that mattered. Eleanor watched his hand move, watched the confident gesture of a man who believed in systems and regulations and the fundamental orderliness of military bureaucracy. "Check the system," she said, "under my DOD ID number. It's in there." David paused, his hand hovering over the clipboard. Something in her voice, some quality he couldn't quite name, made him pull out his phone instead. He tapped at the screen, accessing the range management database, entering her ID number with the skeptical efficiency of someone proving a point. Eleanor watched his face change. It was subtle at first, just a small crease between his eyebrows. Then a widening of the eyes, a slackening of the jaw that would have been imperceptible to anyone who didn't know how to read the microscopic tells that separate a man about to fire from a man about to flee. "This says, he stopped, scrolled, read again. "This says you're cleared for Tier 1 access, all weapon systems, all ranges, permanent authorization dated 2003. "That's correct. But it also says your file is classified. I can see that you have clearance, but I can't see why you have clearance." He looked up from the phone, really seeing her now, perhaps for the first time. "Grandma, what exactly did you do in the Army?" Before Eleanor could answer, a voice cut across the range from behind them, sharp with recognition and something that might have been alarm. "Holy Mother of God." They both turned. A man in his 50s, built like a fire hydrant, his brown face seamed with years of sun and wind, was walking toward them with quick, purposeful strides. His name tape read Ortega, and the chevrons on his collar marked him as a sergeant major, the highest enlisted rank, the kind of man who'd seen everything and been surprised by nothing for at least a decade. But he looked surprised now. More than surprised. He looked like he'd seen a ghost. "Sergeant Major?" David's voice carried a question and a warning. Ortega was his senior, technically, though they worked in different sections. But the older man seemed not to hear him. Ortega stopped directly in front of Eleanor, his eyes locked on something at her collar. She'd pinned it there that morning, the small silver badge shaped like a curved fang, tarnished almost black, catching no light. "Wolf," Ortega breathed the word like a prayer or a curse. "You're Wolf." Eleanor met his eyes, saw the recognition there, saw memories moving behind his pupils like fish in dark water. I used to be, she said, a long time ago. A long Fallujah, Ortega said, November 2004. Second battle. Our convoy hit an IED en route Michigan. 6 Marines pinned down in a courtyard. Sniper fire from a minaret, maybe 800 meters. We couldn't get air support, couldn't get armor through the rubble. We were going to lose them. He stopped, swallowed hard. David was staring at him, at Eleanor, at the small silver fang that suddenly seemed to pulse with significance. 3 shots, Ortega continued, his voice rough. 3 kills. The firing stopped. The Marines got out. We never saw the shooter, never got a name. But that night, our lieutenant, he'd been around longer than the rest of us, he said it was Wolf. Said Wolf was a legend, a ghost, the best sniper in the whole goddamn theater. Ortega's eyes were bright now, too bright. I didn't know Wolf was a woman. I didn't know Wolf was still alive. David looked at his grandmother, this woman he'd known his entire life, this person he'd thought of as mild and quiet and somehow peripheral to the real story of his family's military service. He'd been told his grandfather was the war hero. He'd been told his father had died fighting bravely in Ramadi. He'd been told his grandmother had served as a nurse, helping wounded soldiers. Important work, but not the kind that earned legends, not the kind that made grown men look like they'd seen the face of God. Sergeant Major, David's voice came out harder than he intended. What exactly are you saying? Ortega dragged his eyes away from Eleanor, looked at David with something between pity and disbelief. I'm saying your grandmother is the most lethal sniper in modern United States military history. I'm saying she's got more confirmed kills than any operator I've ever met. I'm saying that little piece of silver she's wearing is a Wolf's Fang badge from Project Wolfpack, and there were only ever 5 of those given out. The words hung in the air like cordite smoke. Somewhere behind them, one of the young soldiers dropped a piece of equipment, the clang absurdly loud in the sudden silence. David looked at the badge, then at Eleanor, then back at the badge. That's not possible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. She was a nurse, my father told me. She worked in field hospitals. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice gentle as a confessor's. Your father told you what I asked him to tell you. I wanted you to have a normal childhood. I didn't want you to be afraid of your grandmother. Afraid? David's laugh came out sharp, almost angry. Why would I be afraid? Because killers should be feared, David, even when they kill for the right reasons. Maybe especially then. The word hung between them. Killer. Not soldier, not warrior, not defender. Killer. The kind of honesty that makes polite conversation impossible. Ortega cleared his throat. Sir, I think maybe you should talk to your grandmother. Privately. He glanced at Eleanor, something like reverence in his eyes. Ma'am, it was an honor to be saved by you. I never got to say thank you. You don't thank wolves, Sergeant Major. You just try not to be the rabbit. Ortega nodded like this made perfect sense, turned and walked away, his stride less steady than when he'd arrived. David stood frozen, his hands clenched around his phone, his world tilting on an axis he hadn't known existed. Eleanor watched him process, saw the same expression she'd seen on her own son's face 18 years ago when she'd finally told him the truth, when she'd shown him the classified portions of her service record, when she'd destroyed forever the comfortable fiction they'd both been living. I need to make a phone call, David said abruptly. Don't go anywhere. I'm not going anywhere, Eleanor said. That's why I'm here. He walked away, the phone already at his ear, and Eleanor turned back to the wooden box on the table. She opened it slowly, her fingers moving with the muscle memory of 10,000 repetitions. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, the Wolf's Fang badge gleamed dully beside 3 sealed envelopes. One marked David, one marked Sarah, one marked Robert. She picked up the badge, held it in her palm, felt its weight. 7 grams, the same weight as a human soul, according to a doctor in 1907 who'd weighed dying patients and claimed to measure the moment of death. Eleanor had never believed that. She'd seen too many people die, and none of them had gotten lighter. If anything, death made people heavier, more real, more impossible to carry. Behind her, David's voice carried on the wind, urgent and confused, speaking to someone Eleanor knew would be Brigadier General Robert McKenna, commander of special operations for the entire Eastern Seaboard, the man who'd pinned this badge on her collar 29 years ago, the man who'd given her the order that had ended Project Wolfpack and haunted her ever since. The man who was, though David didn't know it, her husband. Eleanor closed her eyes and let herself remember. Not Fallujah, not the good memories. the other kind. The kind that visited her at 3 in the morning when the medication wore off and the pain in her knee became a metaphor for the pain everywhere else. She remembered Bosnia, the rooftop, the scope, the face in the crosshairs, Morrison's face. Morrison's eyes looking directly at her across 600 meters, knowing what was about to happen, giving permission with a slight nod that had made her finger freeze on the trigger for 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. She remembered the weight of the decision, not the weight of the trigger pull. That was easy. That was muscle. The weight of deciding that one man's life was worth less than the mission, worth less than the intelligence he might reveal under torture, worth less than the abstract concept of operational security. She remembered squeezing, slowly, professionally, the way she'd been trained. 2.7 pounds of pressure distributed evenly, straight back, no jerking, no anticipation. The rifle had bucked against her shoulder with familiar violence. The round had traveled at 2,800 feet per second, covering the distance in less time than it takes a heart to beat. Morrison's head had snapped back, clean, instant, merciful if you could call murder merciful. The mission had been saved. 200 lives, they'd told her later. 200 American soldiers whose locations would have been compromised if Morrison had talked. The math was simple, 1 for 200. Any calculator in the world would approve that equation. But calculators didn't wake up at 3 in the morning seeing Morrison's face. Calculators didn't forget their grandson's name, but remember perfectly the exact angle of sunlight through the scope, the smell of rotting garbage from the street below, the feel of sweat running down her spine. Calculators didn't develop Alzheimer's disease at 68 years old, the same age her mother had started to fade, the same terrible genetic lottery that would eventually take everything except, cruelly, the muscle memory of how to kill. She opened her eyes. David was still on the phone, his back to her, his free hand making emphatic gestures at the empty air. Eleanor picked up one of the letters, the one marked David, and held it up to the light. She could see the shadow of words through the envelope, her own handwriting, still steady when she'd written it 6 months ago, before the tremor had started, before she'd begun forgetting what day it was. The letter explained everything, her real service record, the missions, the kills, the reason his father had hated her, the reason she'd let him hate her, the reason she was here now, on this range, on this morning, with maybe 12 months of functional memory left before she became a stranger to herself. The reason was standing 30 feet away, arguing into a phone, still believing in the orderliness of military regulations and the fundamental justice of the chain of command. The reason was named David Reeves, and he was about to volunteer for a mission in Yemen that had a 15% success rate and an 8% survival rate, and he was doing it for all the wrong reasons. And Eleanor was going to stop him even if it meant destroying every comfortable lie he'd ever been told about his family, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. A black SUV appeared at the edge of the parking lot, moving fast, followed by 2 more. They pulled up in formation, military precise, and Eleanor felt a sad smile touch her lips. Robert always did have a flair for the dramatic. The doors opened in unison, and men in suits emerged, followed by a figure in Army combat uniform, stars gleaming on his collar. Brigadier General Robert McKenna was 64 years old, built like a boxer gone slightly soft, his face carved from granite in bad decisions. He walked like a man who'd spent 40 years telling other men to walk into gunfire and had somehow survived the guilt. He walked like a man who'd sent his own wife into Bosnia with orders to kill her best friend. Their eyes met across the parking lot, and Eleanor saw all of it reflected back at her, the love, the regret, the shared weight of secrets that could never be confessed to anyone else, the knowledge that they were both damned in ways that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with the things they'd chosen when given impossible choices. David turned, saw the general, saw the entourage, saw his world getting bigger and stranger and more dangerous by the second. He ended his call and stood at attention, muscle memory overriding confusion. McKenna walked past him without a word, walked straight to Eleanor, and did something that made every soldier in the visual range freeze in disbelief. He saluted. Not a casual salute, a parade ground salute, crisp and perfect, held long enough to hurt. The kind of salute that acknowledges not rank, but something deeper, something that transcends the normal hierarchies of the military. Master Sergeant Blackwood, his voice carried across the range like a rifle shot. "It's been too long." Eleanor returned the salute, her arm rising with the automatic precision of 10,000 repetitions. "General McKenna, I appreciate you coming. You called. I came. That's how it works." He dropped the salute but held her gaze. "David doesn't know." "David's about to find out." McKenna nodded slowly, then turned to address the small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the spectacle of a one-star general appearing without warning at a basic qualification range. 20 soldiers, maybe 30, watching with the fascinated attention of people witnessing something outside the normal scope of their experience. "Listen up," McKenna's command voice could have stopped a charging elephant. "I'm going to tell you a story. Some of you are going to find it hard to believe. Those of you who find it easy to believe are the ones who've actually seen combat, because you'll recognize the difference between what war looks like in training and what war looks like when people are trying very hard to kill you." He pointed at the wolf's fang badge on Eleanor's collar. "That badge is from Project Wolfpack, a special operations program that ran from 1994 to 2001. 5 operators, the best of the best. Their job was to hunt high-value targets in environments where conventional forces couldn't operate. They worked alone or in pairs, deep in enemy territory. No support, no backup, no second chances." McKenna paused, letting the information sink in. 4 of those operators are dead. Car accidents, cancer, heart attacks. Or that's what the official records say. The truth is, I don't know how they died. Their deaths are classified above my pay grade, which should tell you something about the kind of work they did. He turned to look at Eleanor, and something in his face softened almost imperceptibly. "The 5th operator is standing right here. Master Sergeant Eleanor Blackwood. Call sign, Wolf, confirmed kills, 173. Missions, 89. Countries operated in, 17. Years of active service, 26. Someone in the bar whispered, "Holy shit," loud enough to hear. McKenna ignored it. "She served in Panama during Just Cause. She was on the ground in Mogadishu when the Black Hawk went down. She deployed to Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq. She has more time in combat zones than most of you have time in the Army." McKenna's voice dropped, became almost conversational. "In November 2004, in Fallujah, she saved 6 Marines with 3 shots from 800 meters in urban terrain with 0 wind data and compromised positioning. The Marines never knew who saved them. Neither did I until I read the after-action report." He looked at David specifically now. "Sergeant Reeves, that woman is your grandmother. She's also one of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. And if she's here, on this range, asking for access to classified files, I suggest you give her whatever she needs, because Wolf doesn't ask for help unless the stakes are higher than you can possibly imagine." The silence that followed was absolute. Eleanor could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind moving through the pines, could hear David breathing like a man who'd been punched in the chest. McKenna walked over to David, lowered his voice so only the 3 of them could hear. "Your grandmother needs to see the Yemen operational plan. She needs to see the casualty projections. And she needs you to listen to what she has to say about it, because she's been exactly where you're about to go, and she knows how that story ends." David looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, trying to reconcile this legend with the woman who'd made him chocolate chip cookies every Sunday, who'd taught him to ride a bike, who'd sat quietly at his father's funeral without shedding a tear, which he'd thought was strange, but now understood was the silence of someone who'd seen too many funerals to have tears left. "Why didn't you tell me?" His voice came out raw. "Why did you let me think you were just a nurse?" Eleanor smiled sadly. "Because nurses save lives, David. Snipers take them. I wanted you to think of me as someone who healed, not someone who killed. I wanted you to have a grandmother you could love without being afraid." "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be. I'm afraid of me." McKenna cleared his throat. "Sergeant Reeves, you're relieved of duty for the rest of the day. Take your grandmother somewhere private. Listen to what she has to say. Read the files she's going to show you. And then decide if you still want to volunteer for Yemen." David started to protest, but McKenna cut him off with a look. "That's not a request, Sergeant. That's an order from a general officer. Dismiss." David saluted mechanically, his mind clearly elsewhere. McKenna returned it, then touched Eleanor's shoulder so briefly it might have been imagined. "Be careful, Wolf," he said quietly. "The truth is a weapon too. sometimes deadlier than bullets. I know, Eleanor said, but it's the only weapon I have left. McKenna and his entourage departed the same way they'd arrived, sudden and dramatic, leaving behind a range full of soldiers who would be telling this story for the rest of their careers, embellishing it slightly with each retelling, until eventually it would become legend and no one would quite remember if it had really happened or if it was just another ghost story in an army full of ghost stories. David stood motionless, staring at his grandmother like he'd never seen her before, which Eleanor supposed he hadn't. He'd seen the mask, the performance, the grandmother-shaped disguise she'd worn for 30 years because it was easier than explaining the truth, easier than watching fear and disgust move across the faces of people she loved. "My truck," Eleanor said, picking up the wooden box. "We'll talk there." They walked across the parking lot in silence, Eleanor moving with that slight hitch in her left knee, David matching her pace automatically. Muscle memory from years of walking beside her. Years of not knowing he was walking beside one of the most dangerous people on earth. She unlocked the F-150, climbed into the driver's seat. David hesitated, then got in on the passenger side, the wooden box now sitting between them like a coffin for small dead things. Eleanor started the engine, let it idle, the old V8 rumbling with the patient strength of machinery built before planned obsolescence. She didn't speak. She'd learned long ago that silence was often more powerful than words, that letting people sit with their confusion often led them to ask better questions than the ones you'd prepared answers for. David broke first. "How much of my life is a lie?" "Not as much as you think," Eleanor said. "Your father died in Ramadi. That's true. He died trying to save his squad. That's true. He was a hero. That's true. But the reason he tried so hard to be a hero, the reason he took risks that got him killed, was because he was trying to prove he wasn't like me. He thought I was a monster. He spent his whole military career trying to be the opposite of what I was." She opened the wooden bag, pulled out a folded piece of paper yellowed with age. "This is a letter your father wrote 2 weeks before he died. The chaplain gave it to me after the funeral. It was never sent." David took the letter with trembling hands, unfolded it carefully. Eleanor watched his eyes move across the page, saw them widen, saw moisture gather at the corners. She didn't need to read it again. She'd memorized every word. "Mom," the letter began, and that alone was significant because her son had called her Eleanor for the last 10 years of his life, had called her Master Sergeant when he was feeling particularly cold, had called her ma'am when forced by military protocol, but never, never mom. The letter was a confession and an apology and a recognition, all folded together in handwriting that got shakier as it progressed, as blood loss and infection made the pen harder to control. It explained how he'd finally understood, here in Ramadi, why she'd made the choices she made, how he'd faced the same choice, follow orders to retreat or stay and fight to save his men, how he'd chosen his men over orders, the same way she'd chosen mission over Morrison, how he was sorry for hating her, how he understood too late that there are no good choices in war, only bad ones and worse ones, how he hoped David would never have to learn this lesson, how he hoped his son would be smarter, would choose peace over glory, would choose family over medals, would choose life over the seductive logic of noble sacrifice. "Tell David that heroes don't follow orders blindly," the letter ended. "Heroes do what's right, even when it costs everything. Tell him I love him. Tell him to be better than both of us." David folded the letter carefully, his hands shaking harder now. A single tear tracked down his cheek, and he wiped it away angrily, the way men do when they've been taught that crying is weakness instead of the only sane response to unbearable weight. "He knew," David said. "He knew he was going to die. The infection had set in by the time he wrote that, he knew. And he still wanted me to know the truth about you, about him, about—" David gestured vaguely, encompassing everything that couldn't be put into words. "About the cost," Eleanor said gently. "The real cost, not the one they put in press releases." David was quiet for a long time, staring out the windshield at the range where his entire understanding of his family history had been destroyed and rebuilt in the space of an hour. When he finally spoke, his voice was small, younger than his 32 years. "What happened in Bosnia, Grandma?" Eleanor had known this question was coming, had prepared for it, had practiced the words in her mind during the long drive to Fort Liberty. But now, sitting here with her grandson, she found all the practiced speeches inadequate. There was no good way to say I killed a man I loved because I was ordered to. "We were betrayed," she said finally. Project Wolfpack. Someone on the inside was feeding information to the enemy. We walked into a trap. 4 of my team died. 1 was captured. Morrison. You've been doing research. Ortega helped before the general arrived. Eleanor nodded. Ortega was a good NCO. Of course he had helped. Lieutenant Jake Morrison was my spotter, my friend, the best soldier I ever worked with. The enemy captured him, started torturing him for information. Information that would have compromised every special operation in the Balkans, 200 American lives. And you were ordered to kill him. We were all ordered, everyone on the team, but they couldn't do it. He was their brother, their friend, so I volunteered. David turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face for something. Maybe permission to hate her. Maybe permission to forgive her. Why you? Because I was the best shot. Because I could do it clean. Because, Eleanor paused, choosing her next words carefully, because I thought if I carried all the guilt, the rest of the team could go home whole. I was wrong. They all died anyway. Different ways, different times, but they all died carrying the weight of what I did. And the person who betrayed you? Eleanor's hands tightened on the steering wheel. This was the part she hadn't told anyone, not even Robert. Still out there, still operating, still sending soldiers into traps because it's profitable. What? David's voice sharpened. You know who it was, and they're still free? I know who it was, I can't prove it. And the proof is buried under so many classifications that even Robert McKenna can't access it. She turned to face him fully. But I know why you were selected for Yemen, David. I know it's the same pattern. High-risk mission, low survival rate. Soldiers chosen not because they're the best, but because they're expendable. The word hung between them like a curse. You think I was chosen to die? I think you were chosen because your death won't cause political problems. Single father, no wife, military family, so the funeral will look good, young enough to be tragic. You're perfect martyrdom material. David's face had gone pale. That's insane. The army doesn't work like that. Parts of it do. The parts that operate in shadows. The parts that need deniability. Eleanor picked up the wooden box again, pulled out the second letter, the one marked Robert. Read this. It's from your step-grandfather, the man you just met. Read it and then tell me if you still think I'm being paranoid. David took the letter but didn't open it. Step-grandfather? You're married to General McKenna? For 9 years. We kept it quiet, military politics, operational security, a lot of reasons that seemed important at the time. Eleanor smiled sadly. Turns out when you spend your whole life keeping secrets, it's hard to stop. David opened the letter, read it quickly, his eyes moving faster and faster. When he finished, he sat back hard against the seat like he'd been shoved. He says the same thing. He says Yemen is a setup. He says there's a contractor named Kessler who's been running these operations for profit. David looked at her. He says you're dying. Alzheimer's disease, early onset, same thing that killed my mother. Eleanor said it matter-of-factly, the way you'd report the weather. I have maybe 12 months before I forget who you are. Maybe 18 before I forget my own name. The skills will stay longer. Muscle memory is the last thing to go. I could probably shoot until the day I die. I just won't remember why. David made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a laugh. This is too much. This is all too fucking much. I know. You should have told me years ago. Would you have believed me? Or would you have thought your crazy grandmother was making up stories to sound important? David didn't answer because they both knew she was right. He would have dismissed it. He would have smiled and nodded and made a note to talk to his doctor about whether early dementia might run in the family. What do you want me to do? He asked finally. Withdraw from Yemen. Stay alive. Be a father to Sarah. Don't make your daughter grow up without you the way you grew up without your father. And let other soldiers go in my place. Let them die instead of me. If you go, you die. If you don't go, you live. The mission will happen either way. Someone will die either way. At least if you live, your daughter has a father. That's survivor's guilt talking, Grandma. That's PTSD. That's math, Eleanor said flatly. Cold, simple math. One life you can save, one life you can't. Choose the one you can save. I can't just abandon my team. You don't have a team yet. You have an assignment. There's a difference. They sat in silence, the engine ticking as it cooled, the sun climbing higher, burning off the morning mist. Somewhere on the range, training resumed. the distant crack of rifle fire punctuating the quiet like a rhythm section, keeping time for a song neither of them wanted to hear. "I need time," David said. "I need to think. You have 72 hours before your deployment window opens. After that, the mission goes with or without you." "How do you know that?" "Because Robert told me. Because I still have access to databases that most generals can't see. Because once a wolf, always a wolf, and wolves know how to hunt." Eleanor reached across the space between them, touched his hand briefly. "Use the time, David. Read the files. Talk to people who know, and then make your choice. But make it knowing all the facts, not just the ones that make you feel brave." David got out of the truck without another word, stood in the parking lot looking lost in a way that had nothing to do with geography and everything to do with identity. Eleanor watched him walk away, shoulders slumped under the weight of new knowledge, and felt the familiar ache of having told a truth that destroyed more than it illuminated. She sat alone in the truck for a long time after he left, holding the Wolf's Fang badge, feeling its sharp edges press into her palm. Somewhere in her deteriorating brain, neurons were misfiring, connections were breaking, memories were dissolving like sugar in rain. Soon she wouldn't remember this conversation. Soon she wouldn't remember David's face. Soon she wouldn't remember her own face. But she would remember this badge. She would remember the weight of the rifle. She would remember the exact pressure of 2.7 pounds. Because the body remembers what the mind forgets. And some skills are carved so deep they exist below consciousness, in that ancient place where instinct lives. She started the truck and drove toward the temporary quarters where Robert was waiting, where they would plan the next 72 hours, where they would try to save one young soldier from a fate that had already claimed too many. Behind her, the range continued its eternal work, teaching young men and women to hit targets made of paper and steel, preparing them for the day when the targets would be made of flesh and bone and moral complexity, preparing them for the moment when they would have to choose between following orders and following conscience. Preparing them, though they didn't know it yet, for the choice that had defined Eleanor's life and destroyed it in equal measure. The choice between the mission and the man, between duty and mercy, between 2.7 pounds of pressure and the weight of a human soul. She drove away from Range 12, the wooden box beside her, the letters inside waiting to deliver more truths to more people. Truths that would save some and destroy others. And maybe, if she was lucky, if there was any justice in the universe. Truths that would mean something after she was gone, after her name was forgotten, after the wolf had finally run its last hunt and lay down in the darkness to rest. The engine rumbled. The road stretched ahead. The sun climbed higher, indifferent and eternal, illuminating a world where heroes died and legends faded, and the only thing that lasted was the weight of choices made in the terrible clarity of crosshairs and consequence. Eleanor Blackwood drove on. The office of Brigadier General Robert McKenna occupied the southeast corner of the command building, positioned to catch the morning light and nothing else. No photographs decorated the walls, no commendations, no flag from his father's casket or shadow box displaying his own medals. Just maps, current and outdated both, pinned with the kind of precision that suggested a man who believed geography was destiny and that if you studied terrain long enough, you could predict where the next body would fall. David Reeves stood at attention in front of the desk, even though McKenna had told him twice to sit down. Some habits ran deeper than comfort. Some protocols existed in the spine rather than the mind, and right now David needed the structure of military bearing because everything else in his world had turned liquid and uncertain. McKenna studied him with the patient assessment of a man who had looked at thousands of soldiers and learned to see past the uniform to the architecture beneath. Fear and confusion and a kind of desperate anger that came from learning your whole life was a carefully constructed lie. "Sit down, Sergeant," McKenna said again, and this time it wasn't a suggestion. David sat. The chair was government issue, uncomfortable by design, the kind that reminded you this wasn't a place for relaxation. McKenna pulled a file from his desk drawer, the paper inside thick enough to make the folder bulge. He set it down between them with the weight of something that could not be taken back. "What I'm about to show you is classified at a level that technically doesn't exist," McKenna said. "The fact that I'm showing it to you anyway is a violation of approximately 14 federal statutes and my oath as an officer. The only reason I'm doing it is because your grandmother asked me to, and I've never been able to refuse her anything important. You said she's your wife. For 9 years, married quietly in a courthouse in Virginia, no guests, No family. Just two old soldiers who'd spent too many years alone and decided that dying alone was worse. McKenna opened the file, revealing a personnel record that looked like it had been through a shredder and reassembled by someone with infinite patience and too much time. We kept it secret because of regulations, because of optics, because in our line of work, love is a vulnerability that enemies can exploit. He pushed the file across the desk. The photo on the first page showed Eleanor 30 years younger, hair still dark, eyes harder than David had ever seen them, wearing combat fatigues and an expression that suggested she'd just returned from somewhere that had changed the molecular structure of her soul. David picked up the file with hands that wanted to shake, but had been trained not to. The service record read like a fever dream, like something from a movie rather than real life. Master Sergeant Eleanor Blackwood, Military Occupational Specialty, 18Z, Special Forces, Senior Sergeant. Current assignment, Project Wolfpack, Special Operations Command. The list of deployments filled 2 pages. Panama, 1989. Somalia, 1993. Bosnia, 1995 through 2001. Afghanistan, 2001 through 2003. Iraq, 2003 through 2010. Each deployment had a small notation beside it, confirmation numbers that range from single digits to the 20s. Each number representing a human life ended by a bullet fired from a rifle that Eleanor had aimed with the cold precision of someone who understood that hesitation killed more people than bullets. 173 confirmed kills, David said, his voice coming out flat, robotic. How is that even possible? Because she's the best I've ever seen, McKenna said simply. Most snipers, the good ones, they have to turn off their humanity to pull the trigger. They have to make the target into a thing, an object, something less than human. Eleanor never did that. She looked at every face. She knew exactly what she was taking. That's what made her different. That's what made her terrifying. David flipped through pages covered in redacted text, black bars hiding information that even now, decades later, could not be trusted to daylight. He found a section labeled Project Wolfpack, and beneath it, a roster of 5 names. Master Sergeant Eleanor Blackwood, call sign Wolf. Master Sergeant Thomas Garrett, call sign Preacher. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, call sign Watcher. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, call sign Phantom. Staff Sergeant Carlos Vega, call sign Shadow. 4 of the 5 had dates of death listed. Only Eleanor and Preacher still showed active, though Preacher's notation read medical retirement, 2003, with a series of codes that David recognized as PTSD designations. 4 dead, David said. My grandmother and this Preacher guy are the only ones left. Preacher lives off-grid in Montana, hasn't spoken to anyone from his Army days in 20 years, won't return calls, won't answer emails. As far as he's concerned, Project Wolfpack died in Bosnia, and he'd prefer to forget he was ever part of it. McKenna leaned back in his chair, and for the first time, David saw the weight the older man carried, the way his shoulders curved slightly inward, as if trying to protect something vital that had already been damaged beyond repair. What happened in Bosnia, sir? McKenna was quiet for a long time, looking past David to the maps on the wall, to terrain features that represented real places where real people had died for reasons that seemed important at the time and meaningless in retrospect. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed registers, dropped into that lower frequency where truth lives. We were hunting a Serbian commander who'd been involved in ethnic cleansing. Bad man, very bad man, the kind who made execution pits look like amateur hour. We had intelligence that he was meeting with an informant, someone who wanted to defect, someone who could give us locations, names, everything we needed to end his operation. McKenna pulled out another file, this one marked with warnings about classification and prosecution. Inside were photos, grainy and dark, showing a compound in what looked like rural territory. The informant was legitimate. The meeting was legitimate. What we didn't know was that someone on our side had sold the operation. Someone told the Serbians exactly when and where Wolfpack would be, turned our hunters into prey. David looked at the photos, trying to imagine his grandmother in that terrain, trying to reconcile the woman who made Sunday dinner with the soldier who walked into ambushes and walked back out alive. They were betrayed. From the inside, by someone who knew the mission parameters, knew the team composition, knew exactly how to set a trap that would kill special operators. McKenna's jaw tightened. 4 members of Wolfpack died in the initial ambush. Phantom and Shadow died in the first 30 seconds. Vega took a round through the throat. Santos died trying to drag him to cover. The intelligence officer with them, civilian contractor, also KYO. That leaves 3, my grandmother, Preacher, and this Morrison. Morrison was wounded in the ambush. Not fatal, but enough to slow him down. Eleanor and Preacher tried to extract him, but the enemy had the high ground, had the numbers, had every advantage. McKenna opened a different folder, pulled out a document that had been typed on an actual typewriter, the letters slightly uneven, showing the age of the report. Command made a decision. Morrison had information about ongoing operations across the entire Balkans theater. If he was captured, if he talked under torture, 200 American soldiers would be compromised. David felt something cold settle in his stomach. They ordered him killed. They ordered the leak neutralized. Those were the exact words, neutralize the leak. McKenna's hands resting on the desk had become fists. The order came through me. I was the one who relayed it to the field. I was the one who told Eleanor and Preacher that they had to kill their friend to save strangers. The office was silent except for the air conditioning, a mechanical whisper that seemed obscene in its normalcy. David tried to imagine receiving that order, tried to imagine being told to shoot someone you'd trained with, eaten with, trusted with your life. His imagination failed. Some experiences existed outside the realm of hypothetical. What did they do? Preacher refused. Put down his weapon, said he'd rather die than shoot Morrison, said he'd face court-martial, spend the rest of his life in Leavenworth. Anything but that. McKenna's voice had gone distant, pulled back 24 years to a decision point that had branched into parallel universes of guilt. Eleanor picked up her rifle. She told Preacher to turn around, to walk away, to have deniability if anyone asked questions later. She said she'd carry it alone. And Preacher let her. Preacher was 26 years old, barely old enough to buy a beer, and he'd just watched 2 friends die in front of him. He was in shock. He wasn't thinking clearly. So yes, he walked away, and Eleanor set up 600 meters from where Morrison was being held, and she waited. McKenna pulled out one more photograph, and David wished he hadn't. It showed a man in his 30s, sandy hair, a face that suggested Midwest origins, and a fundamental decency that had been tested by circumstance and found somehow still intact. He was smiling in the photo, the kind of smile that reached the eyes, that spoke of someone who still believed the world was mostly good. Lieutenant Jake Morrison, 29 years old, graduated West Point with honors, engaged to a woman back in North Carolina. His parents ran a farm in Iowa. He'd planned to go back after his service, raise corn and children, live a quiet life. McKenna's finger rested on the photo as if touching something sacred. Eleanor watched him through her scope for 3 hours while they tortured him. She watched them break his fingers, watched them cut him, watched him endure all of it without saying a word because he knew what was at stake. Jesus Christ! Morrison knew she was out there. He was a trained spotter. He knew the angles, knew the positions, knew where a sniper would set up. And when they finally dragged him outside, when they put him in her sight line, he looked directly at her hiding place. McKenna's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to reveal the man beneath the general. He nodded, gave permission, told her it was okay to do what needed to be done. David felt his throat close. She shot him. 1 round, 7.62 millimeter, through the temple. Morrison was dead before his body knew it was falling. McKenna closed the file, put it back in the drawer, locked it with a small key that he then placed in his pocket. Eleanor completed the mission. She and Preacher extracted separately. The enemy never found Morrison's body, never learned what he might have revealed. 200 American soldiers continued their operations without knowing they had almost been compromised. From a strategic perspective, it was a perfect success. From a human perspective, it was murder. From a human perspective, it was mercy. McKenna met David's eyes. Morrison was going to die either way. Eleanor gave him a clean death instead of a slow one. She saved him from hours more torture. She gave him dignity. But she also took his life, and that's not a thing you recover from, David. That's not a thing that heals. David thought about his grandmother, about the woman who'd sat in the truck this morning holding a silver badge shaped like a wolf's fang, about the tremor in her hands and the fear in her eyes when she'd spoken about forgetting. This is why she has PTSD. This and about 100 other reasons. But yes, Morrison is the big one. The one she can't forget, even as she forgets everything else. The doctors tell me that traumatic memories are often the last to go with Alzheimer's, which means Eleanor will probably die, still remembering the exact angle of the sun through her scope, still seeing Morrison's face, still feeling the weight of the trigger pull. That's not fair. Nothing about war is fair, Sergeant. That's the first lesson and the last one. McKenna stood, walked to the window, looked out at the parade ground where young soldiers were running formations, their cadence calls drifting up like prayers to gods who had long since stopped listening. Your grandmother did what I ordered her to do. She followed the chain of command. She saved American lives at the cost of her own soul. And I let her do it because I was a coward who didn't want to carry that weight myself. You were her commanding officer. You gave a legal order. I gave an immoral order and hid behind legality. There's a difference. McKenna turned back to David. That's why I married her. Not out of love, though that came later. I married her out of debt because she'd paid a price for my decision, and I owed her whatever peace I could provide in the years we had left. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a gun that could never be unfired. David understood suddenly why McKenna had shown him these files, why he'd violated federal law and his own oath. This wasn't about Yemen or conspiracy or saving lives. This was about absolution. McKenna was trying to distribute the weight of his guilt to someone else's shoulders before it crushed him completely. The person who betrayed them, David said, the insider. Do you know who it was? McKenna's face went carefully blank, the expression of a man who'd just been asked a question he'd hoped to avoid. There were investigations, nothing conclusive. The case is still technically open, though no one's actively working it. But my grandmother knows. That's what she said. She knows who it was. She has suspicions. She has patterns. She has 24 years of watching and waiting and collecting evidence that would never hold up in court. McKenna returned to his desk, sat down heavily. And she believes that same person is still operating, still running missions, still sending soldiers into situations where they're likely to die. She believes that person is behind your Yemen assignment. David felt the pieces clicking together, felt the shape of a conspiracy forming in his mind like a constellation that only became visible when you knew where to look. She thinks I was chosen to die. She thinks you were chosen because your death would be convenient. Young father, military family, posthumous hero, the kind of story that plays well on CNN and costs nothing politically. McKenna pulled out one more file, this one current, marked with yesterday's date. This is the operational plan for Yemen. Look at it and tell me if you see anything unusual. David took the file, scanned the mission parameters. 4 operators, deep insertion, high-value target, minimal support, extraction dependent on factors outside team control. The expected casualty rate was listed as 60 to 85%. The expected mission success rate was 15%. These numbers are insane, David said. This isn't a mission. This is a suicide run. That's correct. And yet it was approved at the highest levels, funded through black budget channels, sold to Congress as a proportional response to actionable intelligence. McKenna pointed to a name in the contractor section. See that civilian coordinator? Victor Kessler. He's been attached to special operations for 30 years. He was the intelligence officer in Bosnia, the one who supposedly died in the ambush. David's blood went cold. He survived. He survived and disappeared into the contractor world, where accountability is optional and oversight is a joke. Since 2001, he's been the coordinator for 19 high-risk special operations. Average casualty rate, 72%. Average success rate, 18%. He's either the unluckiest mission planner in military history, or he's deliberately designing operations to maximize casualties. Why would anyone do that? Life insurance, death benefits, equipment losses, contractor fees. McKenna's voice had gone flat, effectless, the tone of someone reciting facts too horrible to engage with emotionally. Every dead soldier generates paperwork, and paperwork generates money. If you own the companies that process the benefits, if you have silent partnerships in the supply chain, if you know how to skim without being obvious, you can make a fortune from failure. David wanted to disbelieve it, wanted to argue that the system had checks, had balances, had people whose job was to prevent exactly this kind of corruption. But he'd been in the Army long enough to know that systems were only as good as the people running them, and people could be bought, scared, or convinced to look the other way. My grandmother wants to expose him. Your grandmother wants to kill him, McKenna said bluntly. She wants to put a bullet in his brain and call it justice. The only thing stopping her is that she's not sure she can pull it off before the Alzheimer's gets bad enough that she forgets why she's doing it. That's why she needs me. She needs someone who can remember after she's gone. She needs someone who can finish it if she can't. McKenna leaned forward. David, I'm going to say something now that I should have said to your father before he deployed to Iraq. Something I should have said to every soldier I've ever commanded. You don't owe this country your life. You don't owe me your life. You don't owe anyone a noble death in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. The general's voice cracked again, broke open to reveal something raw and bleeding beneath. Your daughter Sarah needs her father. Your grandmother needs her grandson. You want to serve. Serve by staying alive. Serve by being there for your family. Serve by refusing to be another name on a wall that no one visits it after the first year. David sat motionless, feeling the weight of permission he'd never been given before. Permission to choose life over glory. Permission to walk away from a mission that would kill him for no good reason. Permission to be something other than a sacrifice on the altar of someone else's profit margin. I need to talk to Preacher, David said finally. I need to hear it from someone who was there. Someone who can tell me if my grandmother is right or if this is PTSD talking. McKenna nodded slowly. Preacher won't talk to anyone. I've tried. Your grandmother has tried. He's locked himself away in Montana and decided that forgetting is safer than remembering. Then I'll make him remember. David stood, his decision made with the finality of a bolt sliding home. I need 3 days leave, emergency family matter. Approved. McKenna stood as well, and for a moment they were just two soldiers who'd spent too long in a profession that rewarded sacrifice and punished survival. David, be careful with Preacher. The war didn't end for him in 2003. He's still fighting it every day. Pushing him too hard might break something that can't be fixed. Understood, sir. David turned to leave, but McKenna's voice stopped him at the door. Your grandmother loves you more than she loves herself. Everything she's doing, everything she's risked, it's all to keep you alive. Don't waste that. Don't throw your life away trying to prove you're as brave as she is. You want to honor her, survive. David nodded once, sharp and military, then walked out into the afternoon heat that felt like a physical presence after the air-conditioned cold of the office. His phone was buzzing before he reached the parking lot. Sergeant Major Ortega, wanting to know what had happened, wanting to help, wanting to be part of whatever this was that had turned a routine day into something that would be remembered long after they were all dust. David ignored the call. He needed quiet, needed time to think, needed to process the information that had just reorganized his entire understanding of his family and his place in it. He drove to his quarters, the base housing unit he shared with Sarah when she was on leave from her own training. The apartment that had been his father's before him, walls painted the same institutional beige that had witnessed 20 years of Reeves family breakfasts and dinners and the kinds of silences that came from loving people who'd chosen dangerous professions. The apartment was empty. Sarah was at Fort Benning for advanced marksmanship training, following in footsteps she didn't know existed, becoming the third generation of Blackwood women who were better at killing than they were at living. David sat at the kitchen table where he'd eaten countless meals, where his father had sat the night before deploying to Iraq for the last time, and pulled out his laptop. He typed in Thomas Garrett, United States Army, retired. The search returned approximately nothing useful. No social media, no address, no phone number. The man had erased himself as thoroughly as regulations allowed. David tried a different approach. He logged into the Army personnel database using credentials that Ortega had given him years ago, credentials that technically should have been revoked when Ortega changed positions, but somehow never were. He pulled up Garrett's service record, found the last known address from his disability paperwork, rural Montana, Flathead County, a P.O. box in a town called Whitefish and nothing else. David booked a flight for tomorrow morning, one way because he didn't know how long this would take, didn't know if Preacher would talk to him or shoot him or just stare at him with the dead eyes of someone who'd already used up their lifetime allotment of caring about anything. He spent the rest of the afternoon reading the files McKenna had let him photograph with his phone. Violation of security protocols be damned. He read about operations in places whose names he couldn't pronounce, about targets who'd been human beings with families and histories before they'd become confirmation numbers in Eleanor's record. He read about the Hunter of Gunmen program that had preceded Wolfpack, about the evolution of sniper doctrine, about the psychological profiles that suggested Eleanor had been selected not despite her empathy, but because of it, because someone had decided that soldiers who felt the weight of what they did made fewer mistakes than soldiers who'd learned not to feel anything at all. He read about his father's unit in Iraq, about the operation in Ramadi that had gone wrong, about the command decision to retreat that his father had disobeyed. The after-action report called it heroic. The internal investigation called it insubordination. Both reports noted that 8 soldiers had survived because of his father's choice, and 1 officer had died, and the math was complicated in ways that no report could capture. He read until his eyes burned and his head ached, and the sun had set over Fort Liberty, casting long shadows across the parade ground where Eleanor had once stood in formation beside soldiers who'd thought she was just another clerk, just another support person, never knowing that the mild-mannered sergeant who typed their orders was the same person who'd killed 17 enemy combatants in a single deployment to Afghanistan. His phone rang at midnight. Sarah, calling from Georgia, her voice bright with accomplishment. She'd qualified expert marksman on every weapon system. She was going to be one of the youngest female snipers in Army history. She was walking in footsteps she didn't know existed toward a destination that had destroyed everyone who'd arrived there before her. David listened to his daughter's joy and felt his heart crack open. He wanted to warn her, wanted to tell her that being good at killing didn't make you a hero, that the best snipers carried the most ghosts, that Grandma Ellie's quiet sadness wasn't personality, but accumulated grief. He wanted to tell her to choose a different career, a safer path, a life that didn't require watching human faces through a scope and making calculations about which lives were worth preserving and which were acceptable losses. But he didn't. He congratulated her, told her he was proud, told her to be safe, ended the call and sat in the dark apartment, understanding with terrible clarity why his father had lied about Eleanor's service, why the whole family had constructed an elaborate fiction that she was just a nurse, just support staff, just someone who'd been near the fighting without actually participating in it. The lie had been a gift. The lie had been protection. The lie had been the only way to let children grow up believing the world was fundamentally just and that their grandmother's hands were clean. But David wasn't a child anymore, and his hands weren't clean either, and the world had never been just. It was time to stop pretending otherwise. He packed a bag for Montana, winter jacket because even in June the mountains could be cold, cash because he suspected Preacher lived in a place where credit cards were surveillance and digital footprints were invitations to government attention. A photo of Eleanor, young and smiling, from before Bosnia, from when she'd still believed that serving her country meant something pure and uncomplicated. He slept badly that night, dreams filled with faces he'd never seen, with Morrison looking through a scope at his own death, with his father bleeding out in Iraqi sand, with his grandmother's hands shaking as she tried to remember his name. He woke at 0400, muscle memory from years of pre-dawn formations, and lay in the dark thinking about families and legacies and the weight of secrets that crushed 3 generations under their accumulated mass. The flight to Montana left at 800. David was at the airport by 600, drinking coffee that tasted like burned regret, and watching CNN report on tensions in Yemen, on military advisors and proportional responses, and all the careful language that meant we're sending soldiers somewhere dangerous, and some of them won't come back, but we're not calling it war because war requires congressional approval. He thought about Victor Kessler, about a man who'd survived by betraying his team, who'd spent 24 years profiting from death, who was still operating somewhere in the shadows, where contractors and black budgets and plausible deniability created a space for people to do monstrous things in the name of national security. He thought about his grandmother, about Eleanor Blackwood, who'd been Eleanor Morrison once, who'd taken her first husband's name and carried it for 40 years until she'd finally married McKenna and become Eleanor McKenna in a courthouse where no one knew her history or cared about the weight she carried. He thought about Preacher, about a man who'd walked away from his best friend's execution, who'd let someone else carry the guilt, who'd lived for 24 years knowing he'd been a coward when courage was required. And David understood suddenly why Preacher drank, why he hid, why he'd chosen a place where the past couldn't find him. Because the past always found you eventually. Memory was patient, guilt was relentless, and the things you thought you'd left behind were just waiting ahead of you. Inevitable as gravity, ready to pull you down into the dark places where truth lived. The plane lifted off into a sunrise that turned the Carolina pines into shadows and gold. David watched his whole life shrink to geometry, watched Fort Liberty become a pattern of buildings and roads and training areas where thousands of soldiers learned skills they prayed they'd never need and pretended they were preparing for scenarios that would never happen. He flew west toward mountains and cold, and a man who tried to erase himself from history. He flew toward answers that would probably hurt worse than the questions. He flew toward the next chapter of a story that had been written before he was born, that would continue after he died, that connected 3 generations in a web of choices and consequences that no one had intended but everyone had to live with. The plane leveled off above the clouds, and David closed his eyes and tried to imagine what he'd say to Preacher when he found him. How do you ask a stranger to relive the worst moment of his life? How do you make someone remember what they'd spent 2 decades trying to forget? He didn't have answers. He just had necessity. And sometimes in war and in family, necessity was the only compass you had, the only thing that told you which direction to walk when all the roads looked equally dark and dangerous. David flew west into the morning, into the mountains, into a past that had never actually been past at all, just waiting patiently for someone to come looking for it, with questions that couldn't be ignored and a need for truth that couldn't be denied. Below him, America stretched vast and indifferent, full of people living normal lives, never knowing that underneath the surface of every family photo and Sunday dinner and graduation ceremony, there were stories like this one, dark and complicated and real. Stories about people who'd made terrible choices for good reasons and lived with the consequences until the consequences finally consumed them. The plane flew on. The sun climbed higher, and somewhere in Montana, a man named Preacher heard his phone ring with a number he didn't recognize and chose not to answer because he already knew what the call would be about, what all calls were about, the only thing anyone ever wanted from him anymore. The truth about what happened in Bosnia, the truth about Morrison, the truth about Wolf, the truth that would set no one free, but would at least distribute the weight more evenly, spread the guilt around until everyone who'd been there carried their share, until no single person had to hold the whole terrible story alone. The truth that David was flying toward without knowing exactly what he'd find, only that finding it mattered, that his grandmother needed him to know, that his daughter deserved to understand what she was inheriting when she picked up a rifle and looked through a scope at a human face and made calculations about lives and missions and the terrible mathematics of war. The plane descended toward Missoula. David gathered his bag and prepared to rent a car and drive north into Flathead County and find a man who didn't want to be found. He prepared to ask questions that had no good answers. He prepared to learn things that couldn't be unlearned. He prepared to become the next keeper of his family's secrets, the next person who'd have to decide what truths could be told and what lies were necessary, and where the line was between protecting people you loved and helping them understand the world they actually lived in, rather than the one they wanted to believe in. The wheels touched down. Montana waited. Preacher waited, though he didn't know it yet. And David walked forward into the story of his family, into the weight of history, into the truth about wolves and the people who hunted them, and the terrible price that hunting extracted from everyone involved. The past was never past. The dead were never dead. And the choices made 24 years ago in Bosnia were still rippling forward through time, still breaking against the present like waves that had been traveling forever and would continue traveling long after everyone involved had turned to dust. David walked forward. There was nothing else to do. Montana in June was a study in contradictions, snow still clinging to the highest peaks while wildflowers erupted in the valleys below, as if the land itself couldn't decide between holding on to winter or surrendering to summer. David Reeves drove north from Missoula in a rental Jeep that smelled like pine air freshener in previous renters, following a 2-lane highway that cut through forest so dense it felt like driving through a tunnel made of living things. The town of Whitefish appeared suddenly, a collection of buildings that suggested logging money from decades past and tourist money in the present, ski resort condos mixed with working-class bars, the kind of place where you could buy a $5 beer or a $50 organic juice, depending on which side of the main street you chose. David didn't stop. The address he had, such as it was, pointed further north, up into national forest land, where property lines became suggestions and the government owned everything but enforced nothing. He stopped at a gas station on the edge of town, the kind with 2 pumps and a handwritten sign advertising night crawlers and deer tags. The attendant was maybe 70, face like weathered wood, eyes that had seen enough of life to be permanently unimpressed by whatever came next. "I'm looking for Thomas Garrett," David said, showing his military ID because civilian credentials meant nothing here and military service was its own currency. "I was told he lives somewhere north of here." The attendant studied the ID with the thoroughness of someone who'd been lied to before and learned to check. "Tom doesn't get visitors." "I know. He doesn't want visitors." "I know that too." "You military?" "Active duty, Sergeant First Class." The old man nodded slowly, calculations happening behind eyes that revealed nothing. "Tom was military once. That was before he came back wrong. I need to talk to him about before. That's probably why he doesn't want visitors." The attendant turned, pulled out a hand-drawn map from beneath the register, the kind locals made when GPS coordinates weren't enough, and you needed to know which fork in the logging road to take and what the third boulder on the right looked like. 15 miles north, private road, but the gates never locked. Cabins another 2 miles in. You'll know it when you see it. How will I know? Because it'll be the only place you can see that looks like someone's trying real hard not to be seen. David took the map, paid for gas he didn't need, and drove north into forest that got progressively darker as the canopy closed overhead. The private road was exactly where the map said, marked by a mailbox that had been shot so many times it was more hole than metal. The gate was open, hanging from one hinge, a statement about not caring or having given up. David couldn't tell which. The road deteriorated from gravel to dirt, to 2 ruts separated by grass, the kind of track that saw maybe 1 vehicle a week and was slowly being reclaimed by a land that had no interest in human convenience. David drove slowly, watching for the landmarks the old man had marked. Third boulder, dead pine leaning left, creek crossing that would be easy now but impassable in spring. The cabin appeared exactly when and how the attendant had promised. A structure that wasn't hiding but wasn't announcing itself either. Built from logs that had weathered to gray, with a roof of green metal, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides like arms reaching for something that was no longer there. A truck sat in front, older than David's rental by a decade, rust eating the wheel wells but the tires new, suggesting someone who maintained what mattered and let everything else rot. David parked 50 yards away, approaching on foot, because showing up in someone's personal space without warning was a good way to get shot, and this was Montana, and Preacher had been trained by the same army that had trained David, which meant he'd react to perceived threats with practiced violence before his conscious mind caught up. The porch boards announced David's approach with creaks that had been engineered that way, an early warning system built from lumber and nails. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, hands visible, making himself harmless through posture and patience. "Thomas Garrett," David called out. "My name is David Reeves. I'm Eleanor Blackwood's grandson. I need 5 minutes of your time." The silence that followed was total. Not even birds, as if the forest itself was holding its breath to see what happened next. Then a voice, rough from disuse and whiskey, came from inside the cabin through a screen door that David hadn't realized was closed. "Eleanor should know better than to send family looking for ghosts." "She didn't send me. I came on my own." "Then you're a fool. Get back in your Jeep and drive away. There's nothing here for you except bad memories that belong to someone else." David stayed where he was. "I'm deploying to Yemen in 72 hours. Mission has an 80% casualty rate. Eleanor thinks I was chosen to die. She thinks the same person who betrayed Wolfpack in Bosnia is still operating, still setting up missions designed to fail. I need to know if she's right or if this is PTSD talking." More silence. Then the screen door opened, and a man stepped out who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts and bad decisions. Thomas Garrett was maybe 6'2", but stooped enough to seem shorter, his frame suggesting muscle that had atrophied through neglect, his face hidden behind a beard that hadn't been trimmed in years. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale and cold, and looking at things David couldn't see. Come up slow, Preacher said. Keep your hands where I can see them. David climbed the steps, noting the small details that spoke of a man who trained himself to notice threats and never learned to stop. The rocking chair positioned to see the driveway. The mirror mounted to catch reflections from the woods behind the cabin. The way Preacher stood with his weight on his back foot, ready to move in any direction. Muscle memory from 2 decades ago, still dictating how he inhabited space. Up close, Preacher looked older than his 66 years. His hands trembled slightly, and his skin had the broken capillaries of someone who drank more than he should and less than he wanted. But his eyes were sharp, tracking David with the assessment of someone who still saw the world in terms of threat vectors and fields of fire. "You look like her," Preacher said. "Same jawline, same way of standing like you're ready for the world to throw something at you. My father was her son. Michael died in Ramadi." It wasn't a question. "Eleanor wrote me a letter when it happened. I didn't respond. Didn't know what to say." What do you tell a woman who's already buried everyone who mattered? You tell her she's not alone. But she is alone. We are all alone. That's what Bosnia taught me. You can stand next to someone, fight beside them, trust them with your life, and still be completely alone when it matters. Preacher gestured to a second rocking chair. "Sit. If we're doing this, we're doing it proper." They sat, the porch wood creaking, the view stretching out over forest that rolled down into a valley where a creek caught sunlight and threw it back like scattered diamonds. It was beautiful in a way that made David understand why Preacher had chosen this place. Beauty as anesthetic, isolation as medicine, the land as a buffer between the man he was and the man he'd been. "Eleanor thinks Victor Kessler betrayed you," David said, not bothering with small talk because Preacher didn't seem like a man who had patience for preliminaries. "She thinks he's still alive, still operating, still setting up soldiers to die for profit." Preacher was quiet for so long that David thought he might have shut down, retreated into whatever internal space he inhabited when the present became too much like the past. Then he reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out a flask that was dented from years of being dropped, and took a long drink that suggested this wasn't his first of the day or his 10th. "Victor Kessler died in Bosnia," Preacher said. "That's what the official report says. Body never recovered, presumed KIA, family notified, case closed." He took another drink. "But Eleanor's right. He didn't die. He orchestrated the whole thing. Set us up, sold us out, walked away clean while the rest of us bled." David felt something cold settle in his chest. "How do you know?" "Because I saw him. 3 years after Bosnia. I was in Virginia trying to drink myself to death in a bar outside Langley. Victor walked in wearing a suit, carrying a briefcase, looking like every other contractor who works the intelligence game. He didn't recognize me. I'd gained weight, grown the beard, looked nothing like the soldier he'd known. But I recognized him. You don't forget the face of the man who killed your friends." Preacher's hands were shaking harder now, the flask moving in small jerks. "I followed him, found out he works for a private military contractor called Sentinel Solutions. They specialize in high-risk operations. They have contracts with DOD, CIA, State Department. They're the people you call when you need something done that can't show up in congressional briefings." "Did you tell anyone? Report it?" "Who would I tell? The same chain of command that sent us into that trap. The same system that classified Morrison's death and called it a training accident." Preacher laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I tried once. Called the Army's CID. They thanked me for my concern and told me the case was closed. 2 days later, I got a visit from 2 men in suits who explained very politely that I was suffering from PTSD, that my memories were unreliable, and that continuing to make accusations could result in me losing my disability benefits. They threatened you. They bought my silence for $3,200 a month. And I took the deal because I was tired and broken, and I didn't have the strength to fight a system that had already beaten me." Preacher's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. "I'm a coward, David. I let Eleanor carry the guilt for Morrison. I let Victor walk free. I took the money and came here and tried to pretend none of it happened." David wanted to argue, to say something comforting about impossible situations and trauma responses, but comfort was a lie and they both knew it. Preacher had made his choices. He'd lived with them. And the price had been everything that made life worth living. "Tell me about Bosnia," David said. "Tell me what really happened." Preacher closed his eyes and David watched 24 years peel away from his face. watched him become young again in memory, watched him return to a place he'd spent 2 decades trying to escape. When he spoke, his voice had changed, had become the voice of someone narrating from a great distance, seeing events through a lens of time and whiskey and accumulated regret. We were hunting Zoran Markovic, Serbian commander, war criminal, ethnic cleansing, mass graves, the kind of evil that makes you believe in hell because you can't imagine a just universe that doesn't have a place to put men like that. Preacher opened his eyes but wasn't looking at David anymore, was looking at something only he could see. We had intelligence that he was meeting an informant, someone who wanted to defect, someone who could give us everything we needed to end his operation. David listened, trying to imagine his grandmother in that scenario, young and capable, and still believing that killing the right people could make the world better. The team was 5 of us, plus Victor as our intelligence liaison. Wolf, me, Morrison, Santos, and Vega. We'd worked together for 3 years. We knew each other's breathing patterns. We could operate in complete darkness using hand signals and trust. We were good, better than good. We were the best. Preacher took another drink. The insertion went smooth. Helicopter dropped us 10 clicks from the target. We moved through the night, standard tactical formation, Wolf on point because she could see in the dark like it was day. We reached the compound at 0400, set up overwatch positions, waited for dawn. His voice had gone flat, affectless, the tone of someone reciting a report rather than living through memory. Victor was with Santos and Vega at the south position. Morrison and I were with Wolf at north. The informant was supposed to arrive at 600. Markovic was supposed to arrive at 6:30. We were supposed to verify the exchange, confirm the intelligence, and then make the call on whether to extract the informant or eliminate both targets. But it was a trap. Worst kind of trap, the kind that looks real until it's too late. The informant showed up on time. Markovic showed up on time. They met in the courtyard like the intelligence said they would. And then at 0631, Serbian Special Forces came through every entrance at once. 25 men, full tactical gear, night vision, suppressed weapons. They knew exactly where we were. Preacher's hands had stopped shaking, had gone rigid, fingers white around the flask. Santos and Vega died in the first 10 seconds. Didn't even get a shot off. Morrison took a round through the shoulder. Victor started screaming into the radio for extraction. Wolf and I laid down covering fire, trying to create space to retreat. But there was no space. They had us bracketed. They had the angles. They had everything. David felt his throat constrict. How did you get out? Wolf, she went full ghost mode, moved through their line like she wasn't even there. Killed 6 of them before they understood they were being flanked. Created enough chaos that Morrison and I could pull back to secondary position. Victor disappeared, just vanished. We thought he was dead, thought they'd gotten him in the initial assault. Preacher looked at David directly now, his pale eyes carrying weight that couldn't be measured. We held that secondary position for 3 hours. Morrison was bleeding bad. I was trying to stop it with field dressings, but the round had clipped his subclavian artery. He needed a hospital. He needed evac. He needed things we didn't have. And then they captured him. He collapsed from blood loss. I tried to drag him, but Wolf said we'd all die if we didn't leave him. Said we'd come back with support, with air cover, with everything we needed, so we retreated. Left Morrison there in the dirt bleeding out, because that's what soldiers do. We make hard choices and live with them. Preacher's voice cracked. Except we didn't get support. We didn't get air cover. Command ordered us to stand down. Said the operation was compromised. Said any rescue attempt would result in more casualties. Said Morrison was already dead and we were to extract immediately. But he wasn't dead. He wasn't dead. They kept him alive. Dragged him into the compound, started working on him. We could hear it over the radio. Morrison had a panic button, emergency beacon. It was still transmitting. We could hear him screaming. Preacher put his face in his hands. We listened to our friend being tortured for 3 hours while command told us to abandon him. David felt sick. Eleanor disobeyed orders. Eleanor did what Eleanor always did. She found a position, set up her rifle, waited for a shot, and when Morrison was finally dragged outside, when they gave her a clean line, she took it. Preacher's voice was barely audible now. 1 round, through the temple, Morrison went down like someone had cut his strings. The screaming stopped. The radio went silent, and I hated her for it. You hated her for mercy? I hated her for having the strength to do what I couldn't. I hated her for making the right choice when I wanted to make the wrong one. I hated her for being willing to carry that weight while I stood there paralyzed. Preacher looked up, and his eyes were wet. I've hated her for 24 years, and I've known the whole time that my hatred is just projected self-loathing. She saved Morrison from hours more torture. She saved our intelligence network from being compromised. She did exactly what needed to be done, and I couldn't forgive her for being braver than me. The confession hung in the air like smoke. David thought about his grandmother, about Eleanor carrying this weight alone, about being hated by someone she'd saved, about living with the knowledge that doing the right thing had cost her the respect of a man who'd been her brother in all but blood. Victor set you up, David said. He told the Serbians where you'd be. Has to be. No other way they could have had our positions. No other way they could have moved with such precision. Victor sold us out, faked his own death, and walked away clean. Preacher stood, walked to the porch railing, looked out at the valley that had become his prison and his sanctuary. And he's been doing it ever since, setting up operations, getting soldiers killed, profiting from failure. Your grandmother's right. Yemen is the same pattern, high risk, low success, maximum casualties. It's his signature. Why doesn't she expose him? Why doesn't she go public? Because he's protected, because he has friends in places that matter, because the kind of people who profit from war don't let their golden geese get slaughtered. Preacher turned back to David. Your grandmother wants to kill him, wants to put a bullet in him the same way she put one in Morrison. End it clean, end it final. But she's running out of time. The Alzheimer's. She called me 6 months ago. First time we'd spoken in 20 years. Her voice was different, softer, less certain. She told me she was forgetting things. Told me she had maybe a year before she forgot everything. Asked me if I'd help her find Victor. Preacher's face twisted. I said no. I said I was done with that life. I said she should let it go, let him win, just live whatever time she had left in peace. She couldn't do that. She couldn't do that. Because Eleanor's not wired to surrender. Never has been. She'd rather die fighting than live in defeat. Preacher walked back to his chair, sat down heavily. She asked me to look after you if something happened to her. Asked me to make sure you didn't volunteer for suicide missions designed to turn soldiers into statistics. I told her I was the wrong man for that job. Told her I couldn't save anyone, couldn't even save myself. David felt the pieces arranging themselves into a picture he didn't want to see. His grandmother dying slowly, her memory dissolving, her time running out, trying to save him from a fate she couldn't prove but knew with absolute certainty. McKenna helping her, carrying his own guilt about Bosnia, trying to make amends for an order that had destroyed the woman he loved. Preacher hiding in Montana, drowning in whiskey and self-hatred, unable to help and unable to stop caring. And somewhere in Virginia, Victor Kessler was planning another operation, selecting another group of soldiers whose deaths would be profitable, whose families would receive flags and condolences and life insurance checks while he collected his percentage and moved on to the next mission, the next opportunity, the next batch of young men who believed they were serving their country when they were really serving his bank account. I'm not going to Yemen, David said. The decision felt inevitable, like admitting to gravity. I'm going to help Eleanor stop Victor. Preacher looked at him with something that might have been hope or might have been pity. You can't stop him. The system protects him. You go after him, you'll end up disappeared. Accident, training incident, heart attack. They'll erase you and call it natural causes. Then we do it the way Eleanor would. We don't go through the system, we go around it. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice. There's a difference. No, Preacher said. There isn't. Morrison taught me that. Eleanor taught me that. Justice is just murder with better paperwork. He stood again, walked into the cabin, came back with something wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing a knife with a 7-inch blade, the steel worn from sharpening, the handle carved with initials that David recognized, J.M. Jake Morrison. He gave this to me the day before Bosnia, Preacher said. Told me if anything happened to him, I should use it to cut free from whatever was holding me back. Told me life was too short to spend it imprisoned by fear or duty or other people's expectations. He held the knife out to David. I never used it. I stayed imprisoned. But maybe you're different. Maybe you're more like Eleanor than like me. David took the knife, felt its weight, understood what Preacher was offering. Not just a weapon. Permission. Absolution. A connection to a man who died before David was born, but whose death had rippled forward through time to touch everything that came after. Help us, David said. Come back. One last mission. Help Eleanor finish what Victor started in Bosnia. Preacher looked at him for a long time, calculations happening behind eyes that had seen too much and remembered all of it. Then he shook his head slowly. I can't. I'm too broken, too drunk, too far gone. I'd be a liability. I'd get you both killed. You're not broken. You're just carrying weight that wasn't yours to carry. Eleanor's been carrying it for both of you. Let her put it down. Help her put it down. I can't face her. Can't look at her and see Morrison's face in her eyes. Can't watch her remember what I made her do alone. She doesn't want your guilt. She wants your help. David stood, Morrison's knife heavy in his hand. We have 72 hours before the Yemen deployment goes forward. 72 hours to find Victor, to stop him, to save the 4 soldiers who are about to walk into the same trap you walked into. Eleanor can't do it alone. McKenna can't authorize it officially. I don't have the skills. But you do. You have the training. You have the knowledge. You have the one thing Eleanor needs most. What's that? A brother who's willing to stand with her one more time. The words hit Preacher like a physical blow. David watched him flinch, watched the resistance crumble, watched 24 years of carefully constructed isolation collapse under the weight of something that had been waiting all along for the right words spoken at the right time. She's dying, Preacher said, and it wasn't a question. She's dying, and she wants to die knowing she saved someone. Saved you from your guilt. Saved me from Yemen. Saved 4 soldiers she's never met from walking into Victor's trap. That's who she is. That's who she's always been. And she needs you to help her do it one last time. Preacher walked to the edge of the porch, gripped the railing, stood there looking at the valley that had been his world for 2 decades. When he spoke, his voice was different, harder, carrying the echo of who he'd been before Bosnia, before Morrison, before everything went wrong. I'll need 2 days to get my affairs in order, close up the cabin, make arrangements. We have 72 hours total. Then we're cutting it close. Preacher turned back to David, and something had changed in his face. Some internal structure had reasserted itself, made him look younger and more dangerous simultaneously. But that's how Wolfpack always operated. Cut it close. Take the risk. Trust your team. He held out his hand. Tell Eleanor I'm in. Tell her Preacher's coming home. David shook his hand, felt the tremor still there, but also the strength underneath. The core of a man who'd been a soldier before he became a drunk, who still had skills buried beneath years of trying to forget them. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly. Victor's not going to just roll over. He's going to fight, and people are going to die. Preacher released David's hand. The question is whether we're willing to be the ones who do the killing, whether we're willing to become what we're hunting. Eleanor already became it 24 years ago when she shot Morrison. No, Eleanor became it when she decided Morrison's life was worth less than the mission. The shooting was just mechanics. The decision was the thing that changed her. Preacher looked at Morrison's knife in David's hand. Don't make that decision lightly. Once you make it, you can't unmake it. Once you decide someone deserves to decay, you become the kind of person who makes those decisions. And that person doesn't get to go back to Sunday dinners and bedtime stories and pretending the world is kind. David thought about his daughter, Sarah, about her voice on the phone full of joy about qualifying as a marksman, about the path she was walking without understanding where it led. He thought about his grandmother forgetting his name while remembering forever the exact pressure of the trigger pull that had killed her best friend. He thought about his father dying in Ramadi trying to prove he was better than his mother when he'd actually been exactly the same, just with different targets and different justifications. I'm already that person, David said quietly. I've been that person since I put on this uniform. I just didn't know it until now. Preacher nodded slowly. Then maybe you're ready. Maybe we're all ready. Maybe it's time to stop running from what we are and start using it for something that matters. They stood on the porch in the Montana afternoon, 2 soldiers separated by 30 years, and connected by blood and choices in the weight of a woman named Eleanor, who was dying slowly while trying to save everyone she'd ever loved. The sun moved across the sky. The creek in the valley caught light and scattered it. Birds resumed their songs, unconcerned with human drama, focused on the eternal work of survival and reproduction and passing genes forward into a future that would remember nothing except what the landscape required. David left as the sun was starting to set, drove back down the mountain with Morrison's knife on the seat beside him and Preacher's promise echoing in his ears. The old man at the gas station nodded as he drove past, a small acknowledgement that he'd succeeded where others had failed, that he'd reached the man the mountain had been protecting and convinced him to come back down into the world where old wars never ended and old debts eventually came due. He called Eleanor from a rest stop outside Whitefish, the phone ringing twice before she answered with a voice that sounded more fragile than it had 3 days ago, as if the Alzheimer's was accelerating, as if knowing her time was limited had made the disease impatient. "I found him," David said. "He's in." "Thank God." Eleanor's relief was palpable. "I wasn't sure he'd agree, wasn't sure he could forgive me." "He doesn't have to forgive you, Grandma. He has to forgive himself, and I think maybe he's ready to start." "Good, that's good." A pause, then, "David, I need to tell you something about Yemen, about Victor, about why I'm so certain this is his operation." "Tell me." "Two of the soldiers selected for Yemen. They're children of soldiers who died in Victor's operations. One is the son of Carlos Vega. One is the daughter of Maria Santos." Eleanor's voice shook. "He's not just killing soldiers for profit anymore. He's targeting bloodlines. He's finishing what he started in Bosnia by taking the next generation." David felt his blood run cold. He knows who they are. He's been tracking military families for 20 years, finding the children of the people he killed, waiting for them to be old enough to enlist, waiting for the opportunity to complete his revenge. Eleanor coughed, a wet sound that suggested pain. "I didn't see the pattern until last week. Didn't realize he was hunting us through our children. And by the time I figured it out, it was almost too late." "Does McKenna know?" "He knows. He's trying to stop the deployment through official channels, but it's been approved at levels above his authority. We have 72 hours before those 4 soldiers ship out. 72 hours to find Victor and end this before more children pay for their parents' sacrifice." David thought about Sarah, about his daughter who carried his blood and his father's legacy in Eleanor's genes. Thought about how easily she could be next, could be selected for some operation that looked legitimate, but was really just Victor Kessler's long revenge playing out across decades. "We'll stop him," David said. "All of us. You, me, Preacher, McKenna, we'll end this." "I hope so, baby. I hope so." Eleanor's voice faded, came back stronger. "Fly home, come to the house. Robert has files, evidence, everything we've collected over the years. It's time to plan this properly. Time to do what Wolfpack was trained to do. Hunt the hunter, and this time we don't leave anyone behind." The call ended. David sat in the rental Jeep in a rest stop in Montana, watching families move between vehicles, children playing, parents exhausted, all of them living normal lives in a country that was kept safe by people like Eleanor and Preacher and Morrison, people who did terrible things in the dark so others could live in the light and never know the price. He started the engine and began the long drive back to Missoula, back to the airport, back to North Carolina, where his grandmother was dying and his daughter was becoming a soldier, and a man named Victor Kessler was planning operations that would kill children to settle scores from a generation ago. The knife sat on the seat beside him, Morrison's knife, 7 inches of steel that had been given as a gift about cutting free from prisons. David picked it up, felt its weight, understood suddenly that every soldier carried a knife like this, literal or metaphorical, a tool for cutting away the things that held them back, for severing connections to peace and normalcy and the comfortable lies that made civilian life possible. He'd carried his without knowing it, his whole life, the knife of legacy, of family history, of obligations that passed from father to son to grandson in an unbroken chain of service and sacrifice. And now he was being asked to use it, to cut away his own safety and comfort, to step into his grandmother's world of hard choices and permanent consequences. He drove south through gathering darkness, through mountains that had witnessed 10,000 years of human drama and would witness 10,000 more, indifferent and eternal, caring nothing for the small struggles of small creatures who built civilizations and wars and called both of them progress. Behind him, Preacher was packing, closing up a cabin that had been both sanctuary and prison, preparing to return to a world he'd fled, driven by guilt and duty, and something that might have been redemption if such things existed for men who'd stood by while their friends died. Ahead, Eleanor was failing, her mind dissolving while her body held on through sheer stubborn will, determined to complete one last mission before the darkness took her completely. And somewhere in Virginia, Victor Kessler was working, planning, setting pieces in motion for another operation that would kill soldiers and profit contractors and perpetuate a cycle of violence that had been running since Bosnia and would run until someone stopped it. 72 hours. 3 days to find a ghost, expose a conspiracy, and stop a revenge plot that had been 24 years in the making. 3 days to save 4 soldiers who didn't know they'd been chosen to die. 3 days to give Eleanor Blackwood one final victory before her memory failed, and she forgot everything except the weight of the trigger pull and the face of Jake Morrison looking through a scope at his own mercy. David drove faster, racing the clock, racing the disease, racing against time itself in a contest that everyone eventually lost, but that had to be run anyway because the alternative was surrender. And Blackwoods didn't surrender, and wolves didn't retreat, and sometimes the only difference between a hero and a fool was which side of the dirt you ended up on when the shooting stopped. The highway stretched ahead, dark and straight, leading back toward conflict and choice, and the kind of moments that defined lives and destroyed them in equal measure. David drove on, Morrison's knife beside him, Preacher's promise behind him, and his grandmother's final mission waiting ahead like a finish line that kept moving every time you thought you were close to reaching it. The war had never ended. It had just been waiting, patient and relentless, for the next generation to arrive and learn that peace was a lie told to children, that safety was temporary, and that every soldier eventually had to decide what they were willing to die for, and more importantly, what they were willing to kill for. 3 days to find out, 72 hours to stop running from legacy and start using it. The clock was ticking, the mission was set, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, Victor Kessler was counting down the same hours toward a deployment that would complete his revenge and secure his profit and add 4 more names to a list that had been growing since Bosnia. Unless Wolfpack stopped him, unless the hunters became the hunted, unless Eleanor Blackwood, dying and determined, could pull off one last miracle with the help of a grandson who'd finally learned the truth, a husband who'd finally found the courage to act, and a brother who'd finally come home from a war that had never really ended. 3 days. The mountains receded in the rearview mirror. The highway led east toward home, toward family, toward the final hunt. David drove on. The safe house sat 20 miles outside of Fayetteville, in the kind of neighborhood where retired soldiers went to die slowly, where every third mailbox had a military bumper sticker, and every fourth house had a flagpole in the front yard flying colors that had been lowered and raised so many times the fabric showed the wear. McKenna had owned the property for 15 years, bought it under a shell company's name, used it for exactly nothing until now, when nothing had become something and something had become everything. David arrived first, driving through the afternoon heat that made the asphalt shimmer like water, the rental Jeep replaced with his own truck because civilian vehicles drew less attention than obvious rentals. The house was a ranch-style brick structure with a 2-car garage and a yard that suggested someone came by once a month to keep the grass from becoming a complete disaster. Nothing about it said military. Nothing about it said special operations. It was designed to be invisible, and it had succeeded. Eleanor's F-150 was already in the driveway, and David felt his chest tighten at the sight of it, at the evidence that his grandmother was here, was real, was still fighting even as her mind betrayed her cell by cell, synapse by synapse. He parked beside it and walked to the front door, which opened before he could knock. McKenna stood there in civilian clothes, jeans and a button-down shirt that made him look like any other retired officer trying to figure out what to do with the rest of his life. But his eyes carried the weight of active command, of decisions being made in real time, of a mission that had moved from theoretical to operational and couldn't be stopped now, even if anyone wanted to. "She's in the garage," McKenna said without preamble. "She's been there since 0600, setting up, planning, doing the things she's done 1,000 times before." "How is she? Physically?" "Fine. Mentally?" McKenna's face twisted. "She asked me twice this morning who I was. Then she saw her rifle and everything came back. Muscle memory is keeping her functional. But we're running out of time, David. Not mission time, her time. They walked through the house, which was furnished with the bare minimum required to pass as lived in. A couch, a table, a television that had never been turned on. The garage had been converted into something else entirely. Maps covered one wall, satellite imagery of what David recognized as the Blue Ridge Mountains. Another wall held photographs, surveillance shots of a man in his late 50s, fit and professional looking. The kind of person you'd see in an airport lounge and assume worked in finance or consulting or any of the other civilian careers that paid well and meant nothing. Victor Kessler, the face that had haunted Preacher for 24 years. The man who'd sold out Wolfpack and walked away clean. The architect of a conspiracy that had been killing soldiers for profit since Bosnia. Eleanor stood at a workbench, her back to them, assembling something with the focused precision of a watchmaker. She wore dark tactical pants and a black long-sleeve shirt despite the heat, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. In front of her lay components for what David recognized as a Macmillan T. Ace 338, a sniper rifle that could reach out to 1,500 meters and touch someone with enough force to remove their existence from the world. "Grandma," David said, his voice soft, not wanting to startle her. She turned, and for a moment, her eyes were blank, looking at him without recognition. Then something clicked. Some internal switch flipped, and she smiled with relief so profound it was almost painful to witness. "David, you're back. Did you find him? Did you find Preacher?" "I found him. He's coming. Should be here within the hour." "Good, that's good." Eleanor returned to the rifle, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, checking the scope mounting, the bolt action, the magazine well. "We'll need him. This isn't a one-person operation." "Not anymore. Victor's too careful, too paranoid. He's got security, ex-military contractors, the kind who know what they're doing and don't ask questions about why." McKenna moved to the map wall, pointed to a location marked with a red circle. Victor's primary residence, 10 acres in Rappahannock County. The house is set back from the road, surrounded by forest. Private security patrol the perimeter on a rotating schedule. 2-man teams, 4-hour shifts. They're armed with standard contractor, loadout, M4 carbines, sidearms, body armor. "How many total?" David asked. 6 contractors on rotation. So at any given time, there are 2 active, 2 resting, 2 off-site. The house itself has electronic security, cameras, motion sensors, the works. But it's all civilian grade, nothing military. Victor's careful, but he's not expecting a serious assault. He's been untouchable for too long. He thinks he's safe. Eleanor spoke without turning from the rifle. He's safe from legal prosecution. He's safe from official investigation. He's not safe from us. The words hung in the air with the weight of a death sentence. David looked at his grandmother, this woman who'd killed 173 people in service to her country, who was preparing to add one more to the list for personal reasons, for justice that existed outside the law, for revenge that was also mercy because stopping Victor meant saving every soldier who would have died in his future operations. "When?" David asked. "Tomorrow night," McKenna said. "The Yemen deployment ships out in 48 hours. We stop Victor before then, we stop the mission. After that, it's too late. The soldiers will be in country, and pulling them out becomes an international incident." 48 hours, David repeated. "That's not much time to plan an operation like this." "We don't need much time." Eleanor turned and her eyes were sharp now, focused. The Eleanor who'd been Wolf looking out from behind the grandmother mask. "We know the target. We know the location. We know the security. This isn't complicated. This is what we've trained for our entire lives. Infiltrate, neutralize the threat, extract. 3-man team, Preacher on overwatch, me on primary, you on support and security." "What about me?" McKenna asked. "You stay here. You're our insurance. If this goes wrong, if we're caught or are killed, you make sure the evidence gets to someone who can use it. You make sure Victor's operations get exposed even if we're not there to see it." Eleanor met her husband's eyes. "You make sure our deaths mean something." McKenna's jaw tightened, but he nodded. He'd been a commander long enough to know when an order was right, even if it felt wrong. Someone had to survive to tell the story. Someone had to remain clean enough to operate in official channels if the unofficial approach failed. The garage door rumbled open, and they all turned, hands moving toward weapons that were suddenly there, that had appeared from concealment with the automatic response of people who'd lived too long in dangerous places. But it was just Preacher, climbing out of a pickup truck that looked older than David, his beard trimmed down to something almost military, his eyes clearer than they'd been in Montana, as if the decision to act had burned away some of the fog that alcohol and isolation had created. Eleanor stared at him, and Preacher stared back, and 24 years collapsed into this moment, into this garage, into the space between two people who'd survived something that should have killed them and had carried the weight separately because carrying it together had seemed impossible. "Wolf," Preacher said, his voice rough. "Preacher," Eleanor replied, "it's been a long time." "Too long, not long enough." Preacher walked forward slowly, the way you'd approach something that might bolt or bite. "I'm sorry for all of it, for Morrison, for leaving you alone with it, for hiding while you kept fighting. You're here now. That's what matters." Eleanor held out her hand and Preacher took it, and David watched them grip each other with the desperate strength of drowning people who'd finally found something solid to hold on to. "I need you for this. Need you to be who you were. Just one more time." "I don't know if I can be that person anymore." "Neither do I, but we're going to find out." Eleanor released his hand, gestured to the maps, the photos, the rifles. "We have one night to prepare and one night to execute. By this time tomorrow, either Victor Kessler is dead or we are. I'm okay with either outcome as long as he doesn't get to keep killing our children." Preacher looked at the surveillance photos, and something dark moved across his face, something that had been sleeping for 24 years and was now waking up hungry. "Tell me the plan." They spent the rest of the afternoon going over details with the obsessive precision of people who knew that small mistakes in planning led to large catastrophes in execution. McKenna had blueprints of Victor's house, obtained through means he didn't explain and they didn't ask about. Eleanor had a timeline of Victor's routine, patterns observed over 6 months of surveillance. The kind of intelligence gathering that would have been impressive for a team and was almost supernatural for a woman working alone while her brain slowly dissolved. The plan was simple in concept, complex in execution. They would approach at 0200 when human alertness was at its lowest, when even trained security contractors fighting circadian rhythms. Preacher would set up overwatch position 800 meters out, high ground with clear sight lines to the house and the perimeter. Eleanor and David would penetrate the property, bypass the electronic security, enter the house, find Victor, and extract the evidence they needed before making the final decision about whether he lived or died. "We need him to confess," McKenna said, playing the role of mission planner even though he wouldn't be in the field. "We need him to admit to Bosnia, to the other operations, to Yemen. We need his voice on recording saying things that can't be explained away or classified out of existence. Then we turn him over to authorities. Let the system handle it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. "The system's been handling it for 24 years, Robert. The system let him thrive. The system protected him. The system is why we're here doing this instead of reading about his arrest in the newspaper. If you kill him, you become a murderer. All of you. I can't protect you from that. I can't make that disappear." "I became a murderer in Bosnia," Eleanor said flatly. "Morrison didn't get a trial. He didn't get due process. He got a bullet because I was ordered to give him one. This is the same thing. Victor betrayed his team. He got people killed for profit. He's planning to do it again. I'm not asking permission from the system that failed to stop him. I'm stopping him the only way that works." McKenna looked like he wanted to argue, but David saw the moment he recognized the futility. Eleanor had already made her decision. This wasn't a planning session. This was a briefing on something that was going to happen whether anyone else agreed or not. They ate dinner together as the sun set, takeout Chinese food that tasted like cardboard but served the purpose of fuel. Eleanor ate slowly, mechanically, her attention drifting between the food and the maps and some internal landscape only she could see. Twice she asked David who he was, and twice he reminded her, and each time the recognition came back with a flash of pain in her eyes that suggested she understood what was happening to her. Understood that she was losing herself piece by piece. "Tell me about Sarah," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice more present than it had been all day. "Tell me about my great-granddaughter." David set down his chopsticks. She's training at Fort Benning, advanced marksmanship. She qualified expert on every weapon system. She wants to be a sniper, following in your footsteps without knowing they exist. She can't, Eleanor said, and there was iron in her voice, the command presence that had made colonels listen when she was just a sergeant. You have to stop her, David. You have to make her choose something else, anything else. She can't walk this path. It destroys everyone who walks it. She's her own person, Grandma. She gets to choose. Not if the choice is made without understanding the cost. Not if she's following a legacy she doesn't know is built on corpses and nightmares. Eleanor's hands were shaking now. Whether from emotion or disease, David couldn't tell. I've killed 173 people. I remember every face. Even as I forget my own name, I remember theirs. Their eyes, the exact moment they realized they were going to die. That's what being a sniper means. That's what Sarah is signing up for without knowing it. Then tell her, David said, after this is over, after Victor, tell her the truth. Let her make an informed choice. I won't remember how to tell her. I won't remember why it matters. Eleanor looked at her hands, at the tremor that was getting worse. That's why this has to be now. Why Victor has to be tomorrow. I'm running out of time to do anything that matters. Running out of time to save anyone. If I can save Sarah by stopping Victor, if I can save those 4 soldiers by ending his operations, then maybe the last thing I do before I forget everything will be something good. Preacher had been quiet through dinner, but now he spoke. What you did in Bosnia was something good, Ellie. You saved Morrison from torture. You saved 200 soldiers from compromise. You made the hard call that I couldn't make. That was good. That mattered. Don't let guilt rewrite history. I killed my friend. You gave your friend mercy. There's a difference. Tell that to his parents. Tell that to his fiancée. Tell that to everyone who loved him and never got to say goodbye because I put a bullet in his brain. I'll tell them you're a hero. I'll tell them you did what was necessary. I'll tell them the truth. Preacher leaned forward. But first we finish this. We stop Victor. We save the kids. Then we figure out how to live with what we've done. They slept in shifts, military habit asserting itself even in civilian surroundings. David took first watch, sitting at the kitchen table with Morrison's knife in front of him, the blade catching street light from the window, throwing small shadows that danced when cars passed. He thought about his father, about Michael Reeves, who died trying to be better than his mother and had ended up being exactly the same, just with a different uniform and different enemies and the same impossible choices. He thought about Sarah, about his daughter who was so proud of qualifying expert, who was walking into a career that would either kill her or change her into someone who could kill without hesitation. And David wasn't sure which outcome was worse. Death was final, but the kind of death that came from becoming someone who could look through a scope at a human face and pull the trigger. That death happened while you were still breathing and you carried the corpse of who you used to be around for the rest of your life. Eleanor woke him at 0200, her hand on his shoulder, her touch light but insistent. It's time to prep. We move out in 2 hours. The garage had been transformed into an armory. Preacher and McKenna had laid out gear with the precise organization of people who'd done this 1,000 times, who understood that in combat, knowing exactly where everything was could mean the difference between living and dying. 3 sets of body armor, level 4 plates rated to stop rifle rounds. 3 sets of night vision goggles, military grade, better than anything civilians could legally own. 3 rifles, 3 sidearms, 3 knives. And Eleanor's Macmillan T AC-338, assembled and zeroed, resting on its bipod like a sleeping predator. They dressed in silence, the ritual of preparation speaking its own language. Tighten straps, check magazines, test radios, verify medical kits. Every movement was ceremony, was prayer, was the acknowledgement that they were about to walk into a situation where mistakes were measured in blood and hesitation was fatal. Eleanor moved through the preparation with mechanical efficiency, but David saw the moments when she paused, when her hands hovered over equipment like she'd forgotten what it was for, when she looked at Preacher and her eyes went blank before recognition returned. The Alzheimer's was accelerating, stress and adrenaline somehow making it worse, as if her body knew this was the last mission and had decided to start shutting down early. Ellie, McKenna said, and she turned to him. He was holding something small, a wooden box that David recognized, the box that had contained the Wolf's Fang badge and the letters. You should leave this here, with me, just in case. In case I don't come back. In case you don't come back. Eleanor took the box, opened it, looked at the letters inside. Her fingers traced the envelopes, the names written in her own handwriting, evidence of a mind that had been clear enough to plan for its own dissolution. Make sure David reads his. Make sure Sarah gets hers. Make sure they understand that everything I did trying to protect them. They'll understand. No, they won't, but maybe they'll forgive me anyway. Eleanor closed the box, handed it back to McKenna, then pulled him close and kissed him with the desperate intensity of people who knew this might be goodbye. I love you, Robert. Even when I forget your name, even when I forget who I am, I'll still love you. It's carved too deep to erase. I love you too. Come back to me, please. I'll try. They loaded into Preacher's pickup truck at 0400, driving north through darkness so complete it felt like being underwater. No conversation, no radio, just the sound of the engine and the road, and three people who'd decided that murder was justice and were driving toward the moment when they'd have to prove it. Victor Kessler's property appeared exactly as the maps had promised. A long driveway cutting through forest, a gate that was closed but not locked, security cameras that Preacher disabled with a handheld jammer that cost more than a car and was definitely not legal for civilian use. They parked a mile out, moved in on foot, ghosts in the darkness, their night vision turning the world into shades of green and gray. Preacher split off at the 800-meter mark, climbing a ridge that would give him overwatch of the entire property. His voice came through the radio, barely a whisper. In position, I have eyes on two contractors, south perimeter. They're walking patrol, lazy, not expecting trouble. Copy, Eleanor responded. We're moving to Breach Point Alpha. David followed his grandmother through the forest, watching her move with an economy of motion that spoke of decades of practice, of a body that had been trained to walk silently and still remembered how, even as the mind that controlled it began to fail. She was beautiful in this context, he realized, dangerous and competent and perfectly suited to this environment. This was who she'd always been. The grandmother mask had been the performance. This was Eleanor Blackwood in her natural habitat. They reached the tree line at the edge of Victor's property, 100 meters of open ground between them and the house. Two-story colonial, lights on in the ground floor, security cameras scanning in predictable arcs. Eleanor watched the cameras, counting, timing, then moved during the gap, covering the distance in 30 seconds, David matching her stride for stride. They reached the house, pressed against the wall, breathing controlled, heart steady. Eleanor pulled out a small device, attached it to the security panel beside the back door. Numbers cycled on a tiny screen, trying combinations, bypassing the code. It took 40 seconds that felt like 40 years before the lock clicked on open. Inside, the house was expensive and empty, the kind of place where people lived but didn't make homes. Hardwood floors, modern furniture. Nothing personal except for a few photographs on the mantle showing Victor with various military and government officials, smiling the smile of someone who belonged in those circles, who was trusted and respectable and hiding monstrous things beneath a veneer of patriotic service. They moved through the ground floor, clearing rooms with practiced precision. Kitchen empty, living room empty, office empty but clearly used, papers on the desk, computers running screensavers. Eleanor paused there, looking at the desk, and David saw her face change, saw recognition and rage, and something colder than either. This is where he plans them, she whispered. This is where he sits and decides which soldiers die and how much profit their deaths will generate. This is where Morrison died, where Vega died, where Santos died, where my son died. Her hand went to her sidearm, and David saw the tremor had stopped, saw her hand steady as stone, as if the prospect of violence had focused her, had given her failing mind something concrete to hold on to. A noise from upstairs, footsteps, someone walking across a floor, bathroom door closing, water running. Victor was home. Victor was awake. And he had no idea that the ghost he'd created 24 years ago had finally found him. Eleanor and David moved to the stairs, ascending in tandem, their movements synchronized through training and blood. The second floor was darker, illuminated only by light spilling from beneath a closed door at the end of the hall. They positioned themselves on either side of the door, and Eleanor's hand went to the knob, turned it slowly, pushed the door open to reveal a bedroom that was occupied by a man who looked exactly like his surveillance photos, who was standing at a dresser in a t-shirt and sleeping pants, who turned at the sound of the door and froze when he saw the rifle pointed at his chest. "Victor Kessler," Eleanor said, her voice carrying 24 years of accumulated rage and grief. "We need to talk about Bosnia." Victor's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, recognition, fear, calculation. He raised his hand slowly, showing himself harmless, but his eyes were already working, looking for weapons, exits, opportunities. "You're Wolf, Eleanor Blackwood. I thought you were dead." "Everyone thinks I'm dead. That's what makes me dangerous." "Whatever you think I did, you're wrong. I'm a contractor. I work for the government. I have clearances. I have protections. You can't touch me." "I already touched you. I'm in your house. I'm pointing a rifle at your heart. Your protections mean nothing." Eleanor took a step forward. "Morrison, Santos, Vega, my son Michael, the 4 soldiers shipping to Yemen tomorrow. Tell me about them. Tell me about the operations you planned that got them killed." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Preacher's voice came through the radio, and Eleanor held up her hand, activating the speaker so Victor could hear. "You remember me, Victor?" "Preacher. The drunk you saw in that bar outside Langley. The one you had threatened into silence. I'm not silent anymore. I'm here. I'm watching. And if Wolf doesn't kill you, I will." Victor's composure cracked slightly. "This is insane. You're all insane. PTSD, paranoia. You can't prove anything." "I can prove everything." Eleanor pulled out a small recording device, set it on the dresser. "This is your chance to confess, to admit what you did, to save yourself from execution by giving us the evidence we need to destroy your operation through legal channels. Or you can refuse, and I put a bullet in you right here, right now, and we take our chances with the investigation. You won't shoot me. You're soldiers. You follow orders. You need authorization. You need someone to tell you it's okay to pull the trigger." Eleanor smiled, and it was the saddest thing David had ever seen. "I had authorization in Bosnia. I had orders. I followed them. I killed my best friend because someone told me to. That's what made me a monster. This time I'm choosing. This time I'm pulling the trigger because it's right, not because I was told to. So yes, Victor, I'll shoot you. And I'll sleep better after than I have in 24 years." Victor looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, and saw the truth in her eyes. Saw that she meant every word. Saw that she'd already made the decision and was just offering him the illusion of choice out of some last vestige of military courtesy. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. Start with Bosnia. Start with how you sold us out." Victor sat down on the bed, suddenly looking older, deflated. "I didn't plan to. I was recruited. A Serbian intelligence officer approached me 6 months before the operation. Offered me money, a lot of money, enough to set me up for life. All I had to do was provide information about upcoming operations, locations, timing, team composition. You sent us into an ambush. I provided intelligence. What they did with it was their business. I didn't think anyone would actually die. I thought you'd abort, thought you'd see it was a trap and pull back. 4 people died in the first minute. Santos, Vega, the intel officer you pretended to be. That wasn't me. There was another contractor there. He died. I made sure everyone thought it was me. Faked my death. Disappeared into the contractor world where no one asks questions about your past as long as you deliver results. And you've been delivering results for 24 years. Operations with high casualty rates. Missions designed to fail, all for profit." Victor nodded slowly. "The defense industry is built on failure. Every dead soldier generates replacement costs, training costs, equipment costs, death benefits. If you own pieces of the companies that process those costs, you make money. It's not personal, it's just business. It's murder." Eleanor's voice was cold as winter. "It's betrayal, and it's ending tonight. Tell me about Yemen. Tell me about the 4 soldiers you've selected to die. They're children of people I got killed. Vega's son, Santos's daughter, 2 others whose parents died in operations I planned. I've been tracking them for years, waiting for them to be old enough to enlist, waiting for the chance to complete what I started in Bosnia. It's not just profit anymore. It's cleanup. eliminating the bloodlines of people who could expose me if they ever figured out the pattern. David felt his stomach turn. This was worse than simple corruption. This was multi-generational revenge. This was a man so broken by his own evil that he decided killing the children of his victims was somehow justified. The recording device blinked its red light, capturing every word. Victor had confessed, had admitted to everything. They had what they needed. They could walk away, turn him over to McKenna, let the system handle it. But Eleanor wasn't lowering her rifle. "What about my son?" Eleanor asked. "What about Michael Reeves? He died in Ramadi. You planned that operation. He disobeyed orders. That wasn't my fault. He was supposed to retreat. He stayed to fight. That's on him. You gave him impossible orders. You put him in a situation where following orders meant abandoning his men and disobeying orders meant dying. You rigged the scenario to kill him. I rigged the scenario to be profitable. If he'd followed orders, he'd have lived and I'd have made less money. Either way worked for me." Eleanor's finger moved to the trigger. David saw it, saw the decision being made, saw his grandmother about to become a murderer for real instead of on orders. And he understood suddenly that he had to choose. Stop her and preserve some illusion of moral high ground, or let her do what she'd come to do and become complicit in her revenge. "Grandma," David said softly, "we have the confession. We have enough. Let McKenna handle it. Let the system work." "The system doesn't work. The system protected him. The system is why we're here." Eleanor's voice was steady, but her hands were shaking again, the disease reasserting itself at the worst possible moment. "He killed Morrison. He killed my son. He's planning to kill 4 more children. How many chances does he get? How many lives is enough? As many as it takes to prove we're better than him. That we're not just killers. That we're soldiers who follow rules even when the rules fail." Eleanor looked at David and he saw her struggling. Saw the woman who'd spent her whole life following orders fighting against the woman who'd spent 24 years carrying the weight of one order that should never have been given. The trigger was there, 2.7 pounds of pressure. She could pull it, end Victor, end the threat, and her own guilt by adding one more body to the pile. But she didn't. She lowered the rifle and David saw the effort it took, saw her physically shaking with the restraint. You're right, and I hate that you're right, but you're right." The window exploded inward, glass fragmenting into 1,000 pieces, and Victor's head snapped back as a round punched through his skull with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the best, who'd learned from Wolf herself, who'd spent 24 years hating himself for not having the courage to pull a trigger and had finally found that courage again. Preacher's voice came over the radio, calm and final. "Target neutralized. I couldn't let him walk away, Ellie. I couldn't let him kill more kids. This one's on me. I'm the murderer. You kept your hands clean." Eleanor stared at Victor's body, at the man who'd destroyed so much, who died without ever being held accountable by the system he'd manipulated. She looked at the recording device, still blinking red, still capturing everything. "We need to go," David said, "now, before the contractors respond." They moved fast, retracing their steps, exiting the house, crossing the open ground. Gunfire erupted behind them, contractors responding to the shot, searching for targets in the darkness. Preacher's rifle spoke again, precise and measured, suppressing the security team, giving Eleanor and David the time they needed to reach the tree line. Then they were running through forest, branches grabbing at their clothes, their night vision turning the world into a confusion of green shapes and moving shadows. Behind them, more gunfire, more shouting, the sound of a security response that had come too late to save their employer, but would be plenty motivated to find his killers. They reached the truck, piled in, Preacher already there, already behind the wheel, engine running. He pulled out fast, no lights, driving by memory and night vision, putting distance between them and the scene of what would officially be called a home invasion, a robbery gone wrong, tragic but ultimately just another statistic in a country where people died violently every day for reasons that made sense to someone. They drove for an hour before anyone spoke. Then Eleanor said very quietly, "Thank you, Preacher, for carrying this one, for making the choice I couldn't make. I owed you one. From Bosnia, from leaving you alone with Morrison, now we're even." Preacher's hands were steady on the wheel. "I killed a man tonight. I feel nothing. No guilt, no regret, just relief that he can't hurt anyone else. Does that make me a monster? No, Eleanor said. It makes you a soldier. A real one. The kind who does what needs to be done even when it costs everything. They arrived back at the safe house as dawn was breaking, the sky turning from black to gray to gold. McKenna was waiting in the garage, his face showing relief and fear in equal measure. He looked at them, saw they were all intact, saw no injuries, and then his eyes went to Eleanor's face, and he knew without being told that something had changed, that they'd crossed a line they could never uncross. Is it done? McKenna asked. It's done, Eleanor said. Victor Kessler is dead. We have his confession. We have evidence of operations going back 24 years. Enough to destroy his company, to stop the Yemen deployment, to save those 4 soldiers. Who pulled the trigger? I did, Preacher said. Wolf kept her hands clean. David kept his hands clean. This one's on me. I'm the only one who needs to run. McKenna was quiet for a long moment. Military mind calculating risks and options and consequences. You don't need to run. Victor Kessler died during a home invasion. Suspects unknown. Security footage was corrupted. Investigation will go nowhere because his company has too many secrets to let it go public. You were never there. None of you were there. Can you make that stick? I'm a general. I have resources. I have connections. I can make a lot of things stick as long as no one looks too hard. McKenna looked at Eleanor. But you need to walk away now, all of you. No more investigations. No more hunting. You got Victor. You stopped Yemen. That has to be enough. Eleanor nodded slowly, but David saw the confusion in her eyes. Saw her trying to remember why they were here, what they'd done, who these people were. The mission had focused her, given her clarity. Now that it was over, the Alzheimer's was rushing back in, filling the spaces that combat had kept clear. Robert? Eleanor said, looking at McKenna like she was seeing him for the first time. When did you get here? McKenna's face crumpled. I've been here the whole time, love. You came back to me. You're home. Home, Eleanor repeated, trying the word out. Yes, home. That's good. I was somewhere. I was doing something important. But I can't remember what it was. David watched his grandmother disappear in real time. Watched the mission fade from her memory like a dream dissolving upon waking. She'd held on long enough to finish it, long enough to save him, to save Sarah, to save the 4 soldiers who would now never deploy to Yemen because there was no longer anyone to plan the operation. She'd held on long enough to matter one last time. And now she was letting go. McKenna guided her inside toward a bedroom, toward rest. Preacher and David stood in the garage, surrounded by weapons and maps and the evidence of a mission that officially never happened. What now? David asked. Now you go home. You go back to your life. You be a father to Sarah. You tell her the truth about her great-grandmother. You make sure she understands what she's inheriting. Preacher started packing gear, methodical and efficient. And you let me disappear. I killed a man. I need to own that. Need to carry it alone. You don't have to be alone. Yes, I do. That's the price. That's what makes it bearable. If I'm alone, if I'm the only one who carries it, then Eleanor gets to forget and you get to live clean, and the only person who has to remember is me. Preacher looked at David. You asked me to come back for one last mission. I came. Mission accomplished. Now I go back to my mountain and my cabin and my whiskey, and I try to figure out if what we did tonight was justice or just revenge with better marketing. David wanted to argue, wanted to say something about brotherhood and shared burdens and how soldiers were supposed to support each other, but he understood. Preacher needed his isolation, needed his mountain, needed to be alone with his choice because being alone was the only way he knew how to process what he'd done. Thank you, David said, for saving my life, for saving Sarah's future, for giving my grandmother one last victory. Thank you for giving me one last chance to be a soldier, to be Preacher again instead of just a drunk who used to be someone. Preacher held out his hand and David shook it. Take care of her, what's left of her. And remember for her, remember that she was Wolf, remember that she was the best. Remember that she saved more lives than she took, even if the ones she took are the only ones that haunt her. Preacher left, driving away as the sun climbed higher, heading back to Montana, back to his cabin, back to a life of isolation that was now justified by action instead of just fear. David watched him go, then went inside to find McKenna sitting beside Eleanor's bed, holding her hand, watching her sleep. How long? David asked. The doctor said 6 months, maybe a year, but I think it'll be faster now. The mission took everything she had left. She held on through sheer will, and now that it's over, the will is gone. McKenna didn't look away from Eleanor. She'll forget you soon, forget Sarah, forget me. But maybe, if we're lucky, she'll forget Morrison too. Forget the guilt, forget the weight. Maybe she'll get to spend her last days peaceful, even if she doesn't know who she is. David sat down on the other side of the bed, looking at his grandmother, at this woman who'd been a legend and a murderer and a hero and a monster and a grandmother who made chocolate chip cookies. At this woman who'd killed 173 people and saved thousands more. At this woman who'd sacrificed everything for a country that would never know her name. "I'll come visit," David said, "every week. I'll tell her stories. Stories about Wolfpack, about Morrison and Preacher, and all the people she saved. Even if she doesn't remember, even if it doesn't mean anything to her, I'll remember for her. I'll carry it forward. That's all any of us can do. Remember for the ones who forget. Carry for the ones who can't anymore. Tell the stories so they don't die with the people who lived them." They sat there together, 3 generations connected by blood and secrets, watching sunrise paint the walls gold, watching the day begin the way all days begin, indifferent to the small human dramas played out in darkness, unconcerned with questions of justice or revenge or whether 4 soldiers lived or died in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. Somewhere in Yemen, 4 soldiers woke up to discover their deployment had been canceled. Operational requirements changed. They'd never know they'd been saved by a dying woman and a drunk and a grandson who'd learned too late what his family had sacrificed. Somewhere in Montana, Preacher unpacked his gear and poured a drink and added another ghost to the collection he carried. Somewhere in government databases, Victor Kessler's files were being quietly erased, his operations shut down, his conspiracies buried under classifications that would ensure no one ever knew the full truth about the man who'd profited from patriotic death. And in a safe house outside Fayetteville, Eleanor Blackwood slept dreamlessly, her war finally over, her mission complete, her memory already fading like footprints in sand erased by waves that never stopped coming, that kept washing everything clean, that kept removing evidence until all that remained was the feeling that something important had happened here, something that mattered, even if no one could quite remember what it was. David sat beside her and made a promise to remember, a promise to carry, a promise to tell Sarah the truth and let her choose her own path with full knowledge of where it led. A promise that Wolf would not be forgotten, that her sacrifice would not be erased, that her story would live on in the people who loved her, even after she forgot she had a story, even after she forgot she was Wolf, even after everything dissolved except the muscle memory of 2.7 pounds of pressure and the weight of choices that could never be unmade. The sun rose, the day began, and Eleanor Blackwood slept on, finally at peace. For now, 6 months passed like water through cupped hands, each day carrying away a little more of Eleanor Blackwood until what remained was more absence than presence, more shadow than substance. She lived with McKenna in a house they'd bought together in those brief years when she still knew who she was, a modest ranch in a quiet neighborhood where retired soldiers went to watch sunsets and wait for whatever came after service. David visited every Sunday, a ritual that had replaced church and carried the same weight of devotion and repetition. Some weeks Eleanor knew him. Some weeks she called him Michael, confused him with the son who died 19 years ago in Ramadi. Some weeks she looked at him with the polite distance of someone greeting a stranger who'd arrived at the wrong house. But David came regardless, because memory was a two-way street, and even if she couldn't remember him, he could remember her, could carry enough recognition for both of them. Sarah came with him this Sunday, her first visit since completing advanced training at Fort Benning. She wore civilian clothes, jeans, and a Carolina Panthers sweatshirt, but she carried herself with the bearing of someone who'd learned to live in uniform, whose posture had been permanently altered by the weight of body armor and weapons and the constant awareness that violence was always one decision away from arriving. McKenna met them at the door, looking older than he had 6 months ago, as if watching Eleanor fade had accelerated his own aging, had made him understand that time was not infinite and love was not enough to stop the erosion of the things we treasured most. His handshake was firm, but his eyes were tired, the exhaustion of someone who'd been on watch too long and couldn't remember what it felt like to rest. "How is she today?" David asked. "Good morning. Bad afternoon." McKenna stepped aside to let them in. She knew my name at breakfast, asked for coffee the way she likes it. Then after lunch, she looked at me like I was a stranger and asked when her husband was coming home. He smiled sadly. I didn't have the heart to tell her I am her husband, so I told her he'd be home soon. She seemed satisfied with that. The house smelled like coffee and old books and something medicinal that suggested illness being managed rather than cured. Eleanor sat in a recliner by the window, looking out at a bird feeder where cardinals and blue jays fought over seeds with the territorial intensity of nations at war. She wore a blue cardigan that made her silver hair look almost luminous, and her hands resting on the armrests showed the tremor that had become constant, a visible manifestation of the neural pathways breaking down, connections dissolving, the architecture of self-collapsing one synapse at a time. Grandma, David said, approaching slowly, giving her time to orient herself, to decide whether his presence was welcome or threatening. I brought someone to meet you. This is Sarah, your great-granddaughter. Eleanor turned from the window, and her eyes, still that same pale blue, moved across Sarah's face with the assessment of someone who'd spent a lifetime reading people, looking for tells and weaknesses and the truth beneath whatever mask they wore. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite recognition, but something deeper. Some genetic echo that whispered, this person matters, this person is blood, this person is worth protecting. Sarah, Eleanor repeated, trying the name out. That's a good name, strong, biblical, the kind of name that belongs to someone who survived. Thank you, ma'am. Sarah stood at attention without meaning to, muscle memory from training, from learning to respect rank and authority, from being shaped into someone who understood that deference was sometimes survival. Don't call me ma'am, makes me feel old. Eleanor smiled, and for a moment she was fully present, fully herself, the woman who'd been Wolf looking out from behind the disease. Sit down, both of you. Tell me things. Tell me stories. I forget everything so quickly now, so tell me things worth forgetting. They sat, David in the chair across from Eleanor, Sarah on the couch, and McKenna brought coffee that no one really wanted, but everyone accepted because ritual mattered, because the forms of normalcy were all that stood between them and the abyss of watching someone disappear in real time. David had brought the wooden box, the one Eleanor had given to McKenna before the mission, the one containing the letters. He set it on the coffee table between them, and Eleanor's eyes went to it immediately, recognition sparking in a way that names and faces no longer managed. I know that box, she said. I made it. In woodshop. High school. Mr. Henderson's class. I was 16 and thought I was going to be a carpenter. Thought I'd build houses. Build things that lasted. She reached for it, and her hands shook so badly that David had to help her, had to guide the box to her lap. What's inside? Letters, David said. You wrote them 6 months ago, before you forgot how to write, before you forgot who we were. You wrote letters for me and Sarah and Robert. Letters explaining things. Letters saying goodbye. Eleanor opened the box, looked at the 3 envelopes, her name written on each in her own handwriting, evidence of a mind that had known it was failing and had tried to leave something permanent behind. Some artifact of consciousness that would outlast the consciousness itself. She touched the envelopes with trembling fingers, and tears ran down her face, silent and steady, the grief of someone mourning their own death while still breathing. I don't remember writing these, she said. I don't remember what they say, but I remember why. I remember being afraid of forgetting, afraid of becoming nothing. She looked at David. Will you read them to me? Will you tell me who I was? David took the envelope marked with his name, opened it carefully, unfolded pages covered in Eleanor's handwriting, still steady when she'd written this, still clear and precise, the hand of someone who'd spent decades writing after-action reports and kill confirmations and letters to families who'd lost soldiers to bullets that Eleanor herself had fired. He read aloud, his voice carrying through the quiet house, each word a small resurrection of the woman who'd written them. The letter spoke of love and regret and the weight of 173 confirmed kills. It spoke of Morrison in Bosnia and the moment when Eleanor had looked through a scope at her best friend's face and made a choice that had defined the rest of her life. It spoke of Michael, David's father, and how Eleanor had let him hate her because hate seemed safer than truth, seemed like a wall that would protect him from understanding what war really cost. It spoke of Yemen and Victor Kessler and the mission that David would never know about officially, but that had saved his life and the lives of 4 soldiers who'd wake up one morning to discover their deployment had been canceled for reasons no one would ever explain. It spoke of Preacher and McKenna and the men who'd carried pieces of her guilt so she wouldn't have to carry all of it alone. And it spoke of Sarah, of the great-granddaughter Eleanor had never really known, but loved anyway with the fierce protective instinct that transcended memory and lived somewhere deeper than the brain, somewhere in the blood and bone, where legacy was written in genetic code that survived even when names and faces faded. "Don't be a sniper," David read, his voice breaking on the words. "Don't follow my path. Choose something else. Anything else. Because once you look through that scope at a human face and make the calculation about whether they deserve to die, you become the kind of person who makes those calculations. And that person doesn't get to come back. That person is changed forever in ways that have nothing to do with courage or patriotism or serving your country. You'll do your job perfectly. You'll hit every target. You'll be the best. And you'll hate yourself for it. You'll carry faces with you that you can't forget and names that you wish you could. Choose something else, Sarah. Choose life. Choose mercy. Choose to be better than me." Sarah was crying now, silent tears that she wiped away with the back of her hand, military bearing preventing the full collapse that wanted to happen. The grief of reading advice from a woman who'd already forgotten writing it, who was sitting right here but was also already gone, had been gone for months, was just a ghost wearing Eleanor's face. "I can't quit," Sarah said, speaking to Eleanor but also to the letter, to the woman who'd written it. "I'm already committed. I've signed papers. I've taken the oath. I'm going to sniper school next month." Eleanor looked at Sarah with eyes that were suddenly sharp, focused, pulled back from whatever fog they had been lost in. "Then you listen to me, girl. You listen good. Being a sniper isn't about shooting. Any fool can learn to shoot. Being a sniper is about choosing. Every time you put someone in your crosshairs, you're choosing. Choosing that they die and you live. Choosing that your mission matters more than their life. Choosing that the calculations you make in 3 seconds are more important than the 50 years they might have lived." She leaned forward, and despite the tremor, despite the disease, she radiated an intensity that made the room smaller, made the air thicker, made everyone present understand that they were witnessing something important, some transmission of knowledge that could only happen in moments like this, when death was close enough to touch and the stakes were too high for anything except brutal honesty. You make those choices, you carry them forever. Every face, every name, every moment when you could have missed and didn't, could have hesitated and didn't, could have chosen mercy and chose the mission instead. Eleanor's voice dropped lower, became almost a whisper. "And someday, maybe 50 years from now, you'll sit in a chair like this one, and you won't remember your own name, won't remember your family, won't remember anything except the faces of the people you killed, because that's what the disease takes last. The trauma, the guilt, the weight, everything else fades, but that stays. That's what you're signing up for, Sarah. That's the real price." The room was silent except for the sound of breathing and the clock on the wall marking time, with small mechanical clicks that sounded like a rifle being loaded, over and over, an endless cycle of preparation for a shot that never came. "I still want to do it," Sarah said, her voice small but steady. "I want to serve. I want to be like you." "Then be better than me. Make better choices. And when the time comes to pull the trigger, when you're looking at a face and doing the calculations, remember that you have a choice. You always have a choice. The mission is important. But so are you. So is the person in your crosshairs. And sometimes the right choice is the one that costs you everything. Sometimes the right choice is missing on purpose, is letting someone live even when orders say they should die, is choosing mercy even when it means failing the mission." Eleanor sat back, exhausted, and the clarity faded from her eyes like a bulb dimming, like watching someone drift away on a current they couldn't fight. "I'm tired," she said. "I need to rest. But before I do, I want to tell you all something. Something I need to say while I still remember how." They waited, David and Sarah and McKenna, 3 generations and a husband, all of them watching this woman who'd been a warrior and a grandmother and a killer and a protector, who'd spent her life walking the line between those roles and had never quite figured out which one was real and which one was the mask. I don't regret Morrison, Eleanor said. I don't regret the mission. I don't regret choosing duty over the man I loved. What I regret is that I had to choose it all, that we live in a world where those choices exist, where someone has to decide that one life is worth less than 200 lives, where someone has to carry the weight of that mathematics forever. She looked at each of them in turn, imprinting their faces, trying to hold on to the moment even as it slipped away. Don't build a world where those choices are necessary. Don't raise children who have to become weapons. Don't create situations where mercy becomes weakness and hesitation becomes betrayal. That's my legacy to you. Not the missions, not the kills, not the wars won or lost. My legacy is this: do better, be better, make a world where no one has to be wolf. She closed her eyes then, and McKenna stood immediately, moving to her side, checking her pulse, her breathing, making sure this was just sleep and not the final sleep that they'd been expecting for months. But she was breathing steady, just exhausted, just used up from the effort of being present, of fighting through the fog long enough to say something that mattered. I'll take her to bed, McKenna said. You two should go. Come back next week. Maybe she'll be lucid again. Maybe not, but come back anyway. David and Sarah left, walking to the truck in silence, both of them carrying the weight of words that had been spoken by a woman who was already half ghost, who existed in the space between memory and forgetting, between presence and absence. They drove for 10 minutes before Sarah spoke. Take me to Fort Liberation, she said. Or take me to the range where you met her, where this all started. David drove to Range 12, the place where 6 months ago Eleanor had appeared with a wooden box and a contractor badge and had detonated his entire understanding of his family. The range was empty on Sunday afternoon, just red dirt and target berms and the ghosts of 1,000,000 rounds fired by soldiers preparing for wars they hoped would never come. They walked to the firing line, and Sarah pulled out her phone, made a call that David couldn't hear, spoke in low tones to someone who apparently had keys and authority, because 15 minutes later, an armory tech showed up with a rifle case and a knowing look that suggested McKenna had made arrangements, had anticipated this moment, had understood that some lessons could only be taught in the places where they mattered most. The tech opened the case to reveal Eleanor's Macmillan T. AC-338, the rifle she'd used on the mission against Victor Kessler, the rifle she'd carried for 30 years through wars and training exercises and all the moments in between. It was immaculate, maintained with the obsessive care of someone who understood that equipment failure could mean death, that a rifle was not a tool, but a partner, that the bond between shooter and weapon was as intimate as marriage and more permanent than love. General McKenna said your great-grandmother would want you to shoot this, the tech said. Said she'd want you to understand what it feels like, the weight, the responsibility, the reality of what a sniper does. Sarah took the rifle with reverence, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment, despite holding something that had killed people, that had been the instrument of Eleanor's will, that carried the weight of all those choices compressed into steel and wood and the precise engineering that made killing at a distance possible. David helped her set up, positioning the rifle on its bipod, adjusting the scope, checking the ammunition, 7.62 millimeter rounds, boat-tail hollow points, the kind that tumbled when they hit tissue, that created wounds too catastrophic for any field medic to repair. He loaded 5 rounds into the magazine, chambered one, set the safety. Target is at 800 meters, David said, falling into the role of spotter without conscious thought, muscle memory from training that had never quite left him. Wind from the east, 3 miles per hour. Temperature is 68 degrees. Barometric pressure is standard. The target is a piece of paper with a circle printed on it. But in your mind, make it real. Make it a face. Make it a person who has a name and a family and 50 years of life ahead of them. Make it someone you have to choose to kill. Sarah positioned herself behind the rifle, her body settling into the proper stance with the automatic precision of someone who'd been trained well, who'd learned the fundamentals and practiced them until they became second nature. She looked through the scope, and David watched her face change, watched her understand suddenly that this wasn't just shooting at targets, that the act of looking through magnified optics at something far away and making the decision to end it was fundamentally different from any other form of violence. I see it, Sarah said. The target, 800 meters, center mass. What do you see in your mind? A man, maybe 30 years old, wearing a uniform, enemy uniform. He's a threat. He needs to be neutralized. Why? Because that's the mission. But why is that the mission? Who decided? Who made the calculation that his life is worth less than your objective? Who gave the order? And are you sure they were right? Sarah's breathing changed, became less steady, the reality of the questions undermining the automatic responses she'd been trained to give. I don't know, I'm just following orders. That's what Eleanor said. That's what every soldier says. I was just following orders. I was just doing my job. I was just serving my country. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all you need. But Eleanor wants you to think about it, wants you to understand that the order doesn't absolve you, that following orders is a choice, that you could refuse, could miss on purpose, could choose mercy even when it costs you everything. If I choose mercy, the enemy wins, the mission fails, more people die. Maybe. Or maybe the calculation is wrong. Maybe the intelligence is bad. Maybe the person in your crosshairs is innocent. Maybe you're being used by someone who profits from your willingness to kill without question. David's voice was harder now, carrying the weight of everything he'd learned about Victor Kessler, about Bosnia, about his father in Yemen, and all the missions that had been designed to fail for someone else's profit. Eleanor killed 173 people. She was following orders for all of them, and she lived with every face for 50 years. Is that what you want? Is that a fair trade? Your conscience for someone else's mission? Sarah pulled back from the scope, sat up, looked at David with eyes that were suddenly too old for her face, that had aged years in the span of minutes. What do you want me to do? Quit? Give up? Refuse to serve? I want you to serve with your eyes open. I want you to make choices instead of just following orders. I want you to understand that every time you pull that trigger, you're choosing, and the person you become is the sum of all those choices. Eleanor chose wrong sometimes. Chose the mission over mercy. Chose orders over conscience. And it destroyed her. I don't want that for you. Your great-grandmother doesn't want that for you. We want you to be better. Sarah looked at the rifle, at this machine designed for the sole purpose of killing people from a distance where you couldn't hear them scream, couldn't see them bleed, couldn't witness the full consequence of your action. She ran her hand along the stock, feeling the wood that Eleanor's hands had touched, that had absorbed the sweat and oil and tremor of a woman who'd carried more weight than anyone should have to carry. I'll think about it, Sarah said. I'll make my choices with my eyes open. I'll question the orders. I'll remember that mercy is an option. But I'm not quitting. I'm not walking away. I'm going to sniper school. I'm going to serve. And maybe I'll make different choices than she did. Maybe I'll be better. But I can't be better by running. I can only be better by walking the same path with different values. David nodded slowly, understanding that this was as much as he could ask, that Sarah was her own person and would make her own mistakes and carry her own weight. Then shoot. Show your great-grandmother that her legacy continues. Show her that someone remembers what she taught. Sarah repositioned behind the rifle, settled into her stance, controlled her breathing, looked through the scope at a target that was just paper but represented everything else. Her finger moved to the trigger, felt the resistance, the 2.7 pounds of pressure that separated thought from action, intention from consequence. She squeezed slowly, steadily, with the precision of someone who'd been trained by the best and had learned the fundamentals well. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with violence that was controlled, expected, absorbed. The round traveled downrange at 2,800 feet per second, covering 800 meters in less than a heartbeat, and struck the target dead center. Perfect shot. Textbook technique. Eleanor would have been proud. Sarah worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round, and fired again. And again, and again. 5 shots, 5 perfect hits, grouping so tight they could have been covered by a silver dollar. She was good. She was very good. She was going to be one of the best. And that was exactly what terrified David. They packed up the rifle, returned it to the armory tech with thanks and a strange sadness that came from understanding that some objects carried more history than they had weight, that this rifle was not just metal and wood, but also memory and choice and the accumulated weight of all the lives it had ended. They drove back to David's quarters in silence, and Sarah said she needed to walk. needed to think, needed time alone with the weight of what she'd learned and what she'd chosen. David watched her go, this young woman who carried his blood and Eleanor's genes and a destiny that had been written before she was born, that pulled at her with the gravity of legacy and duty and the terrible seduction of being good at something that mattered. 4 months passed, summer turned to fall, and the Carolina heat gave way to cooler nights and the smell of burning leaves and the kind of weather that made David think of endings and changes and the way seasons marked time in ways that calendars never quite captured. Eleanor declined steadily, the Alzheimer's taking her in pieces until what remained was barely recognizable as the woman who'd been Wolf. She stopped speaking in complete sentences, stopped recognizing anyone, even McKenna, stopped being able to feed herself or dress herself or do any of the things that defined independence and personhood. McKenna hired a hospice nurse, a kind woman named Patricia who'd seen this before, who knew the stages and the timeline and how to make the end as comfortable as possible. She told McKenna that Eleanor was in the final stage, that it would be days or weeks, not months, and that he should say whatever needed saying because the window for being heard was closing fast. David brought Sarah to visit one last time, on a Sunday morning when the light came through the windows, at an angle that made everything look softer, more forgiving, as if the world itself was trying to gentle the transition from presence to absence. Eleanor lay in a hospital bed that had been set up in the living room, her body small beneath white sheets, her breathing shallow but steady, her eyes open but looking at nothing, focused on some internal landscape that no one else could access. McKenna sat beside the bed, holding Eleanor's hand, talking to her in a low voice about their life together, about the missions they'd shared, about the love they'd found too late and cherished too briefly. He told her about Victor Kessler, about how the Yemen mission had been canceled, about how 4 soldiers had lived because of her choice to act, about how her final mission had saved lives the same way all her missions had saved lives, even when the cost had been pieces of her soul. David and Sarah stood at the foot of the bed, witnesses to this ending, to this quiet surrender of a woman who'd fought for 50 years and had finally decided that rest was more important than resistance. Sarah held David's hand with a grip that was too tight, that suggested she was holding on to something more than just her father's hand, that she was trying to anchor herself against the current of grief that wanted to pull her under. Eleanor's breathing changed suddenly, became irregular, the rattle that Patricia had warned them about, the sound that meant hours, not days. McKenna looked up, met David's eyes, and the unspoken understanding passed between them that this was it, that the woman they loved was leaving, that all they could do now was be present, was witness, was give her permission to go. "It's okay, Ellie," McKenna said, his voice breaking. "You can rest now. You've done enough. You've saved enough people. You've carried enough weight. You can put it down. You can let it go." Eleanor's eyes moved, focused briefly on McKenna's face, and something like recognition flickered there. Some last spark of the woman she'd been. Her lips moved, forming words that had no sound, but McKenna leaned close, listened, understood. "She says to tell Preacher she forgives him," McKenna said, tears running down his face. "She says to tell David to protect Sarah. She says to tell Sarah to choose mercy. She says she's sorry. She's sorry for all of it. For Morrison, for Michael, for being Wolf when she should have been a grandmother. She's sorry. Tell her we forgive her," David said. "Tell her we love her. Tell her she was enough." McKenna whispered the words, and Eleanor's hand squeezed his once, weakly, a final communication from someone who'd spent her life being strong and was now using the last of her strength to hold on for just one more moment, just long enough to hear that she was loved, that she was forgiven, that her life had meant something beyond the kills and the missions and the weight she'd carried. Then the hand relaxed. The breathing stopped. The eyes that had seen so much, that had looked through scopes at faces that haunted her forever, that had watched her best friend die and her son die and herself die by degrees, those eyes closed for the last time. Eleanor Blackwood, Master Sergeant, United States Army, retired, call sign Wolf, 173 confirmed kills, 89 classified missions, 50 years of service and sacrifice, was gone. The room was silent except for the sound of McKenna sobbing, the sound of a man who'd lost the only person who'd ever really understood him, who'd shared his guilt and his choices and his knowledge that they were both damned in ways that had nothing to do with God and everything to do with the things they'd done in service to a country that would never know their names. David held Sarah while she cried, held his daughter the way Eleanor had never been able to hold him, the way his father had never been able to hold him, breaking the cycle of distance and silence and military bearing that had kept his family separated by duty and honor and the weight of things that couldn't be spoken. "She's free now," Sarah said through tears. "She doesn't have to remember anymore. She doesn't have to carry it." "No," David agreed. "Now we carry it. We remember for her. We tell her story. We make sure Wolf is not forgotten." The funeral was held at Fort Liberty with full military honors, the kind of ceremony reserved for soldiers who'd served with distinction, whose sacrifice deserved recognition, even if the details of that sacrifice had to remain classified. 100 soldiers attended, most of them young, none of them knowing who Eleanor really was, what she'd really done, why the coffin was draped with a flag, and why a 2-star general stood at attention as it was lowered into the ground. But some knew. Ortega was there, the sergeant major who'd been saved by Wolf in Fallujah, who'd spent 20 years not knowing the ghost who'd saved him, had been an elderly woman with silver hair. Preacher was there, having driven from Montana, looking older and more sober than David had seen him, his eyes dry but carrying a grief that went deeper than tears. And scattered through the crowd were others, veterans of operations that officially never happened, who'd heard that Wolf had died and had come to pay respects to a legend they'd never met but whose work had saved their lives. The honor guard fired their rifles, 3 volleys that echoed across the cemetery like the punctuation at the end of a sentence that had run too long. A bugler played taps, the notes rising and falling with the weight of every military funeral ever held, every soldier ever buried, every family ever broken by service and duty, and the demands of a country that asked its children to die in places most people couldn't find on a map. McKenna accepted the flag, folded with precise military corners, each fold representing something: honor and sacrifice in the 13 colonies, and all the other symbolism that was supposed to make death meaningful, but really just made it more formal. He held it against his chest and looked at the coffin and understood that he'd buried 2 people today, Eleanor and Wolf, and that he'd spend the rest of his life trying to figure out which one he'd loved more. Sarah stood beside David, wearing her dress uniform, her ribbons and badges marking her as someone who'd chosen the same path Eleanor had walked, who'd decided that service mattered more than safety, that being good at killing was worth the cost to her soul. She'd made her choice with her eyes open, and David could only hope that she'd make different decisions than Eleanor had made, that she'd choose mercy more often than the mission, that she'd learn to live with the weight instead of being crushed by it. The ceremony ended. People dispersed. The coffin was lowered into the ground that would hold it forever, or at least until the sun burned out and the earth stopped turning, and all the graves and all the grief and all the wars became equally meaningless in the face of cosmic indifference. David and Sarah stayed after everyone else had left, standing beside the grave, looking at the headstone that had been prepared in advance, that bore Eleanor's name and rank and years of service, but nothing about Wolf, nothing about Wolfpack, nothing about the missions and the kills and the weight she'd carried. Just a name and dates and the phrase, "she served with the honor," which was both true and completely inadequate. "I'm going to sniper school next month," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "I'm going to be the best. I'm going to make her proud." "She's already proud," David said. "She was always proud. But she wanted you to understand the cost, wanted you to choose with full knowledge of what you're signing up for." "I understand the cost. I'm willing to pay it." That's what she said. That's what they all say. And then 50 years later, they're lying in a bed forgetting everything except the faces of the people they killed. Is that what you want? Sarah looked at the grave, at the fresh earth that would settle and grass that would grow, and the stone that would weather and eventually become just another marker in a cemetery full of markers, all of them representing people who'd lived and been forgotten by everyone except the few who loved them. "I want my life to matter. I want to serve. I want to be part of something bigger than myself. If the cost is carrying ghosts, then I'll carry them. Someone has to." David wanted to argue, wanted to grab his daughter and shake her and make her understand that there were other ways to matter, other forms of service, other paths that didn't end in a grave surrounded by soldiers in silence. But he understood that she'd made her choice the same way Eleanor had made hers, the same way he'd made his, the same way every soldier made theirs, driven by duty and honor, and a need to believe that sacrifice meant something, that giving pieces of yourself to a cause larger than yourself was noble rather than just tragic. Then make her promise mean something, David said finally. Choose mercy when you can. Question the orders when they feel wrong. Remember that every person in your crosshairs is someone's child, someone's parent, someone who matters to someone. Don't let the mission be more important than your humanity. Don't become so good at killing that you forget how to live. I promise, Sarah said, and David hoped she meant it. Hoped she'd remember this moment when she was looking through a scope at a human face and doing the calculations about whether they deserved to die. Hoped she'd hear Eleanor's voice saying, choose mercy, choose life, choose to be better than me. They walked back to the truck, leaving Eleanor in the ground beneath a stone that didn't tell her story, that reduced a life of complexity and violence and sacrifice to a name and dates and the kind of platitudes that made everyone feel better about death without actually addressing the reality of what had been lost. 6 months later, Fort Liberty dedicated Range 12 as the Eleanor Blackwood Memorial Range, a ceremony attended by generals and sergeants and soldiers who'd never met her, but understood that sometimes legends needed to be honored, that sometimes the people who did the hardest things deserved recognition, even when the details of what they'd done had to remain secret. McKenna spoke at the dedication, his voice steady despite the grief that still sat on his shoulders like body armor he couldn't remove. He talked about excellence and service, and the soldiers who operated in shadows so others could live in light. He didn't mention the kills. He didn't mention Bosnia or Yemen or Victor Kessler or any of the specifics that would have made the story true. He told a sanitized version of Eleanor's life, the kind that could be spoken at public ceremonies, the kind that turned complicated humans into simple heroes. But afterward, he found David and Sarah and Preacher, and they walked to the range together, to the firing line where Eleanor had first confronted David, where this whole story had started 6 months before she died. They stood in silence, 4 people who knew the truth, who carried pieces of Eleanor's story, who would remember when everyone else forgot. She'd hate this, Preacher said, looking at the plaque that bore Eleanor's name and called her a hero. She'd say heroes don't exist, just people making hard choices and living with the consequences. She'd also say that someone has to remember, McKenna replied. Someone has to tell the story so the next generation understands the price, so they don't walk into this thinking it's glorious, so they know what they were really signing up for. David thought about the letters in the wooden box, now stored in a safe in his home, artifacts of a mind that had known it was failing and had tried to leave something permanent behind. He thought about reading them someday to his own children, if he had them, explaining who their great-great-grandmother had been, what she'd done, what she'd sacrificed. He thought about the weight of that telling, the responsibility of carrying history forward, of being the keeper of stories that couldn't be forgotten, even though they caused pain. Sarah stepped up to the firing line, and McKenna handed her something he'd been carrying in his pocket. The Wolf's Fang badge, silver and tarnished, the symbol of Project Wolfpack, the marker of someone who'd hunted gunmen and become a legend. She wanted you to have this after, when you graduated sniper school, when you'd earned it through your own actions rather than just inheriting it. Sarah took the badge, held it in her palm, felt its weight, 7 grams, the weight of a soul, the weight of a choice, the weight of a legacy that she could either honor or reject but could never ignore. I'll wear it, she said. I'll remember what it means. I'll choose mercy when I can, and when I can't, when the mission requires violence and death and all the things she did, I'll carry the weight the way she carried it, with honor, with awareness, with the understanding that every shot costs something that can never be repaid. She pinned the badge to her uniform, and the 4 of them stood at attention, a final salute to a woman who'd served for 50 years and died with only a handful of people knowing the truth about what that service had cost. The wind moved across the range, carrying the smell of gun oil and red dirt and something else, something that might have been memory or might have been just the ache of knowing that everyone you loved would eventually leave, and all you could do was hold on to them while they were here and remember them accurately after they were gone. They walked back to the parking lot together, and Preacher stopped at his truck, turned to face the others. I'm going back to Montana, back to my mountain, but I want you all to know something. Eleanor saved my life, not in Fallujah or Bosnia or any of the missions. She saved it by giving me permission to come back, to act, to be preacher one more time. I killed Victor Kessler. I'll carry that. But I'll carry it knowing it mattered, knowing it saved lives, knowing it was the right choice even if it was also murder. That's her gift to me, the ability to live with what I've done by understanding why it needed doing. He shook hands with McKenna, with David, with Sarah, then climbed into his truck and drove away, back to isolation, back to his cabin, back to a life of remembering and caring, and being the keeper of secrets that could never be told but had to be preserved because forgetting would be worse than the pain of remembering. McKenna left next, his general's stars carrying the weight of command and the greater weight of a marriage that had been too brief and too complicated and too full of shared guilt to ever be explained to anyone who hadn't lived it. He'd bury himself in work, David knew, would spend his remaining years trying to reform the system that had used Eleanor and broken her and called it patriotism. He'd fail probably because systems were stronger than men, but he'd try, and the trying would give meaning to his own grief, would turn loss into purpose. David and Sarah stood alone in the parking lot, father and daughter, the inheritors of Eleanor's legacy, the next links in a chain of service and sacrifice that stretched back generations and would continue forward until someone finally broke it, finally decided that duty and honor and sacrifice were luxuries a family could no longer afford. "I'm scared," Sarah admitted, her military bearing dropping for just a moment, revealing the young woman beneath the soldier's mask. "I'm scared I'll become her, that I'll make the same choices, that I'll end up in a bed somewhere, forgetting everything except the people I killed." "That's good," David said. "Fear means you're paying attention. Fear means you understand the stakes." Eleanor wasn't afraid enough. She thought she could carry it all alone. But you don't have to. You have me. You have your family. You have people who'll remember for you if you forget. People who'll carry pieces of the weight so you don't have to carry it all. Will you come visit me? When I'm at sniper school? When I'm deployed? When I need to remember who I am underneath the uniform? Every chance I get, I'll remind you, I'll tell you Eleanor's story. I'll make sure you never forget that you have a choice. That mercy is always an option. That being good at killing doesn't mean you have to kill. They got in the truck and drove away from Fort Liberty, away from Range 12 and Eleanor's memorial, in the place where Wolf had finally been laid to rest. They drove through North Carolina countryside that was beautiful in the way only familiar landscapes could be. Beautiful because it was home, because it was known, because every road and tree and building carried memories of life lived in time past. Sarah would leave for sniper school in 2 weeks. She'd trained for 6 months. She'd learned to shoot at distances where human faces became abstract circles in a scope. She'd learned to calculate wind and distance and the million variables that separated a hit from a miss. She'd learned to control her breathing and her heartbeat and her emotion. She'd learned to become a weapon in service to her country. And David would pray that she'd also learn to remain human, that she'd remember Eleanor's warning, that she'd choose mercy when possible and carry the weight when not, that she'd be better than her great-grandmother had been, not because Eleanor had been bad, but because Eleanor had been the best, and the best had still paid a price that no one should have to pay. The sun set behind us as they drove east, painting the sky in colors that suggested endings and beginnings, that reminded David that every day was both a death and a birth, that time moved forward relentlessly whether you were ready or not, whether you'd resolved your grief or were still carrying it, whether you'd learned the lessons the universe was trying to teach or were still struggling to understand the questions. Somewhere in Montana, Preacher poured a drink and toasted the ghost of a woman who'd given him one last chance to matter. Somewhere in Virginia, McKenna sat in an empty house and looked at photographs of a woman who'd been his soldier and his wife, and his burden and his love. Somewhere in heaven or hell or nowhere at all, Eleanor Blackwood rested, finally free from memory, finally released from the weight of 173 confirmed kills in a lifetime of choosing duty over mercy and mission over love. And somewhere in the future, Sarah would look through a scope at a human face and make her choice. And that choice would either honor Eleanor's memory or repeat her mistakes. And no one would know until the moment arrived which path she'd choose, which legacy she'd claim, which version of herself she'd become. The road stretched ahead, the sky darkened, and David drove on, carrying his daughter toward her destiny and his mother's memory, in a future that was unwritten but inevitable, shaped by choices not yet made but already pulling at them with the gravity of duty and honor, and the terrible seductive promise that sacrifice meant something, that giving pieces of yourself to something larger was noble rather than just necessary, was heroic rather than just tragic. The wolf was dead. Long live the wolf. And may her memory be a warning and a blessing and a reminder that every hero is also a cautionary tale, that every legend is also a tragedy, and that the price of freedom is paid not just in blood, but in the peace of your soul you give up every time you choose the mission over mercy, duty over compassion, the shot over the hesitation that might have saved you from becoming someone you no longer recognize when you look in the mirror. David drove on. Sarah sat beside him, and Eleanor's ghost rode with them, invisible but present, a passenger in every car carrying soldiers toward war, a whisper in every briefing room where missions were planned, a weight on every trigger finger deciding whether to squeeze or relent, to kill or show mercy, to be wolf or be human. The choice, always the choice, forever the choice until the last soldier came home and the last war ended and humanity finally learned that some prices were too high to pay, no matter how noble the cause, no matter how important the mission, no matter how many lives were saved by the willingness of a few to do violence in the dark so many could live in the light. The sun set, the world turned, and the story of Wolf became legend, became memory, became the kind of tale that fathers told daughters and grandfathers told grandsons, simplified and sanitized and stripped of the horror that made it true, until all that remained was the lesson. Serve with honor, choose with conscience, and remember that every hero carries ghosts. And the weight of those ghosts is the real price of the medals and the memorials and the thanks of a nation that will never fully understand what it asked and what was given and what was lost in the translation between duty and humanity, between following orders and maintaining soul, between being a soldier and remaining a person who could still recognize themselves when the uniform finally came off, and nothing was left except the memories of all the faces that would never fade, that would stay forever, that would outlast everything else until the final darkness came and even memory itself dissolved into whatever came after. Whether it was peace or judgment or simply the end of a story that had gone on too long and cost too much and meant everything and nothing depending on who was telling it and who was listening and whether anyone was left who still remembered the truth beneath the legend, the woman beneath the wolf, the human beneath the hero. Eleanor Blackwood, 1957 to 2025. She served, she sacrificed, she survived everything except her own memory. And in the end, that was mercy too. Writing Eleanor's story broke me, the letter scene especially. My grandfather was a Korean War vet with Alzheimer's. He forgot everything except the faces of men he lost. Eleanor gave everything to protect strangers, her marriage, her son, her memory. That's the real cost of service nobody talks about. Do you know a veteran who carried that weight? Share their story below. Let's honor them. If this moved you, subscribe. More stories coming. These soldiers deserve to be remembered. What hit you hardest? Bosnia, the Alzheimer's, or her death? Comment below.